They would take them into town, from the town, out of town, into forests, made them dig their own graves, and then shot them. The Jews were in trucks. The men and boys were in trucks. And they took Joseph Aronowitz' brother Zelig, a man named Shapiro and a man named Avram Gershon, to the wall of the study hall and then shot them. And I asked a couple times to my father, "What? Tell me about your father." He never saw him again.
Welcome out to the God and Country podcast. We have a tremendous guest with us this week. It's probably one of the ones I've been looking forward to the most. We've got Marshall Meyers coming in live from Chicago, as well as Ingrid is actually coming in live from Cancun, Mexico. This is going to be our first international podcast because she's down there on vacation. Ingrid, how are things going down there in Cancun?
It's been lovely. I highly recommend this place. The hospitality is wonderful. If you're ever in Cancun, try the Waldorf out, the Riviera Maya.
I would love to be down there. I'm sure everybody's quite jealous of you at this point with the sunny skies and the warm beaches down there.
Oh, yes.
Marshall, I like I said, I've been looking forward to this for a tremendous amount of time. Because you as a historian, you've put together a pretty significant selection of people who have survived the Holocaust. You've personally interviewed each one and compiled their stories. You've dedicated, 30 plus years to this?
More than that, but yeah, close.
30 plus years to this and being a historian of that era. And what we really want to point out is the similarities between what was happening back there in the days of Hitler and what is happening now, because they're scarily similar. And it should not be. We should be recognizing that for what it is. History is repeating itself, and it shouldn't be. So, Marshall, kind of go into your upbringing, where you grew up, how you grew up.
Okay. Thank you, Uriah and Ingrid. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I grew up in a family of 3 boys and very loving parents in the south side of Chicago. Very little extended family on my father's side. And as relates to the Holocaust, we never really asked questions. This is the 1960s, and people didn't ask questions then. People didn't want to talk about it. And even survivors who'd come out didn't want to discuss it. They wanted to rebuild their lives and focus on the future, and it was too hard to discuss it. In hindsight, there were times my father used to come home from work and lay down on the couch and just stare at the ceiling, kind of lost. And I realized he was probably thinking of survivor guilt, even though he wasn't a survivor, as I'll detail. But he left 2 weeks before they closed the gates of Lithuania. And he had an aunt and uncle here, his mother's siblings. And that was it. There was no family. He had lost his brother, his sister, lost total contact. His mother died young, so he had a stepmother, his father, extended family, cousins, and he had lost total contact with them. And I think many times he just would look at the ceiling kind of blankly, wondering, why me? Why was I the one to survive?
And he grew up in Lithuania, right?
He grew up in Lithuania, and he left and he was 26. And we have a letter that he sent, or his aunt and uncle, his mother's siblings. His mother died early. His mother died in 1927 in childbirth. And this was 1939. The war starts breaking out, but it hit Lithuania in June of 41. And he sends a letter dated June 9th of 1941. His aunt and uncle sent it to my father's father. And it comes back stamped with swastikas, opened, sent back via the Yankee Clipper. And it was not a handwritten stamp. It was a government stamp. So this was a policy. There were obviously rolls of tape that said in German, geöffnet, and sent back. So there was no communication, which until 1946, when one of his townspeople came to Chicago, and he found out what happened to his family, there was just nothing. They knew that there was just no communication, no ability. There wasn't long distance phone calls then. And people were at a loss for what happened to their family. They knew probably that they weren't alive anymore, but they didn't know what happened.
So,
And then
kind
after
of
my father
explain
passed away in
how you grew up with
1978,
that. Did you get any knowledge from him? Did he share anything with you? How were you raised essentially
that's a great
from
question.
your father? And then how did you get your morals and values, what you believe in?
So that's a great question. In terms of finding out at the Sabbath table Friday night, sometimes snippets would come out. I asked once, and I wasn't mature enough or understanding enough to ask more at the time, sadly, but I asked once, why didn't your brother and sister leave? Why didn't your father leave? They all had, many Lithuanian Jews had visas to go to Johannesburg. And my father said they all thought it would get better. And by the time it didn't get better, and then he made a motion of a knife to his neck. He said, by the time it didn't get better, it was too late, and there was no leaving. But we grew up in a family, an Orthodox Jewish family, an observant family with, great standards and wonderful, wonderful friends and a great community, and an emphasis on being positive and being good people and treating people nicely. And the synagogue was a very closely knit community. We were close with the rabbi. We were close with a lot of friends. And I think it was a very positive upbringing for the most part.
Did anybody from your synagogue come from that same environment, Lithuania, Germany? Anybody
Yes,
there from the
there was
Holocaust
one
as well?
man, an older man, Mr. Hollander, and he was German. And all we had heard about Germans is they were bad. And I was afraid of him as a little kid because I didn't know that, obviously he was a German Jew. But there were a number of survivors. There was one man who's in his 90s, who lives about 2 blocks from me, who I went to school with his children. And we'd always heard things, but it was never really discussed publicly. And I've read extensively lately, there was one survivor who escaped Birkenau. And when he came to Hungary, where he was from, and he told people what's happening, they didn't believe him. And even post-war in the late 40s, when Jews came to New York to rebuild their lives and they told their stories, people didn't want to believe them. It was too unbelievable that the highest culture, Germany, the highest culture in the world, was gassing hundreds of thousands and millions of people. Not just Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, people who objected to them, priests who spoke out against them, Polish people, intelligentsia who spoke out against them. And it was hard to believe. So for the most part,
it was hard to believe because people wanted to believe that humans wouldn't be that horrific, that another human wouldn't do that type of evil to another human being, and they didn't want to believe it until pictures actually started coming out, and then all of a sudden the whole media changed.
And hard to believe even today, even though there's pictures you can find everywhere, how many people don't believe. It's incredible.
The day the Holocaust Museum opened in Skokie, there were major protests, and I was with my son shopping just north of there in a mall, and they sent traffic way around because these Nazi protesters were protesting with signs of the Holocaust was a hoax and it didn't happen. And that was a major danger. So when I do tours at the Holocaust Museum here, where I'm a certified docent, I always begin with, when the museum opened in 2009, that day alone was an important reason why the museum was needed, because of those kind of people. It's needed even more today with the crazy world we live in, and with the protests and the denials of things from the Twin Towers to what's happening today in the world. So I think the need and the message of all these memorials and Holocaust museums is more critical today than it ever has been before in the world.
Agreed.
I completely agree with that, because history will repeat itself if we don't understand it, we don't study it. And right now, in the major universities, nobody's studying it.
No,
we see what's
not
going on.
There are some courses. Illinois has a law that teaches that the Holocaust must be taught in high school. I just did a 7-week class at Ida Crown Jewish Academy, the school I grew up in, teaching Holocaust. And for me, it was a very powerful experience. was high
So
school
you're
seniors.
saying even in the public schools right now, it's a law,
Yes,
it must be taught?
it is a law that it must be taught.
Oh,
Illinois was, I think,
wow,
one of the
thank
first, if not
heavens.
the first.
That's
But
crazy.
the kids really don't know. Most of the kids are bad, or I don't want to say bad students. They're not educated well. And so they really don't know the history. They really don't know. If you would ask them what's Birkenau or what happened in Nazi Germany or how many people were killed, they really sadly don't know.
I'm noticing that a lot, that World War II was so long ago for the current generation that they don't even study it anymore. I mean, a lot of them will study the Middle East. I mean, they'll study the Gulf War, the Afghanistan wars, the Iraq wars, and then it's difficult for them to go back farther because even the Vietnam War, the Korean War is being lost in our schools because they just don't teach that back that far. And World War II is just getting lost in history, and World War I even less, which was the reason why World War II even started, was because of World War I, and just that history is just gone. And you go even back even further, and why this current generation is losing its values when it comes to the United States of America, because even the Civil War and the Revolutionary Wars are not being studied in the depth that they should be studied in our current schools and universities. I don't know why that curriculum has changed, but it has. But then you go and look at what's happening in our major universities and see that they're all siding with Hamas and Palestine in this current conflict. And you see exactly what Hitler started is starting again. The same indoctrination, the same control of the media, the same control of the narrative is happening all over again. And people are not recognizing that, which is why we wanted to do this specific podcast, because we wanted to see those similarities. Going back to your father, so your father grew up in Lithuania, got out of Lithuania. At that time, Lithuania was controlled by Russia before the war, and he was in Lithuania before the war, or the war started. Was he there during Russian
No,
control?
so he had left in 1939. 2 weeks later, they closed the gates. But he discussed with us, and my brothers and I have all put together little snippets that we heard over the years. And he said that Lithuania under Russia, when the Nazis were starting to rise in power in 39, Lithuania was the first test country that Hitler used to see what will the indigenous population do when we come to take away the Jews. And the history in this small town, in Yiddish they call it a shtetl. This shtetl had been over 700 years old. There were about 2,000 people, approximately 70 to 80 Jewish families, approximately 500 Jews. So they were a significant minority. And at points of looking at censuses over the early part of the 20th century, the Jews were up to 50% of the population. They were literate, both in Lithuanian and in Hebrew and in biblical studies. Bible studies were a part of their daily routine at synagogue services. It was a very small community, but everyone knew everyone, and Jews occupied many of the businesses. My grandfather was sold bolts of clothing later, to make clothing. Later, he was a baker. There were tailors, there were shoemakers, there were woodcutters, there were businessmen, there were flour mill operators. But for the most part, they were much more educated than their Lithuanian counterparts. And that caused the ire and hate of their Lithuanian counterparts.
Why do you think that was? I mean, was that stem from the Russians just not having the education system? What's created that uneducated populace within that country?
That's a great question. But in general, I think in Eastern Europe, then in Poland and Lithuania, education wasn't so important. They went to work as farmers, and they had menial labor. So if you didn't stay in school and you didn't stick to your education, it's easy to be jealous of someone who has a better lot in life than you. And then there was the adversarial, sadly, the religious differences, the belief differences between what the Lithuanian Gentile population believed and what the Jews did, and how the Jews practiced and how they dressed. So there was an adversarial relationship where my father described once how on Passover Eve, when it coincided with Easter, they would the houses were mostly wood houses with heavy duty shutters that would close the windows. And Easter night, he said the Gentile population was often very drunk, and they would come looking to harm and do things to Jews. They knew where the Jewish houses were, but they were sealed up tightly. And he recalled as a little kid just being in your house with any light out, candle, no candle lit, so that no one would know they were home, just fearing for their lives, hearing the Gentile population going through the town, just breaking windows and doing whatever they could. So
And
in
this was
general,
before Hitler too, right?
yes, in general, it was an adversarial relationship. Once Hitler started to rise to power in 1939, he used Lithuania as that testing ground. And sadly, in the opening days of the war, and there had always been an adversarial relationship. So they got along, but for the Jewish population, as much as I've done survivor interviews of about 8 survivors of the town, none of whom is alive today, sadly, and there are probably no direct survivors of the town, of Jewish survivors, but they described it in a very utopian-like society where there were daily services in the morning and at night. There were biblical classes at night, and it was a closely knit community, and they just wanted to live and not get into adversarial relationships. But when Hitler came in June of 1941, around June 2nd to 3rd week of June 1941, he comes to Lithuania, and one important element of the destruction of European Jewry that Hitler employed was using general ordinary people. There's a book called Ordinary Men 101 by Browning, and it describes how there were 4 units called the Einsatzgruppen, which is a mobile killing squad. It was Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D. A was the southernmost, and D was the most northern. And Einsatzgruppen A was in Lithuania, and they were lawyers, they were businessmen, they were clerical workers, they were simple people who had an opportunity to get things during that era that weren't easily available. So the Einsatzgruppen was fueled with extra rations of liquor and whatever drugs they wanted, and food and vodka. And the Einsatzgruppen went from town to town, basically destroying the Jewish population. And they logged it in a book called Documents of Destruction by Raoul Hilberg, a famous historian. He had written down all the logs of the Einsatzgruppen are public knowledge, and they wrote down every day how many men they killed, how many women they killed, how many children they killed. They would take them into town, from the town, out of town, into forests, made them dig their own graves, and then shot them. And the initial times they were buried with their clothing, which was a problem because later Lithuanian Gentiles would come to those mass graves that were unmarked and dig them up to look for valuables in the pockets of the people who were in that mass grave. As relates to specifically in this town of Lokava, when the war broke out in Lithuania, Germany bombed it, and the Jews knew that they were better off under Russia than under Nazism. Under Nazism, they were petrified, obviously. Under Russia, it wasn't good, but it was better than what they would have had under Nazism. But Lithuanian population hated the Russian occupation with just cause. So they sided with the Nazis, and the Jews sided with the Russians. So that also added to the adversarial relationship. In June 41, about the 3rd week, they come into Lokava, and the war had started a little bit with bombing, and the Jews had run to the open fields, knowing that there was no reason for the Nazis to bomb the open fields and they'd be safer there. By the time they came home 3 days later, and this survivor, who I spent many hours with over the years, with my brother interviewing him, Joseph Aronovitz, told me by the time they came back, their houses were looted. Their beds were gone, their whatever china, silver, et cetera, They were looted by the population. I never really thought about this, and when I went to this town, Lokava, Lithuania, in 2019, 5 years ago, about 5.5 years ago, I realized that my grandmother's tablecloths and silverware were probably still in the town somewhere. Someone probably had them. There was no way to tell. But they take the men, they go through the town, and the priests of the town cooperated fully with the Nazis, along with a bunch of the population. They're going from house to house. Joseph Aronovitz tells me they burst into his home, and he looks at the guy with the priest and the Nazis, and he says, "You're my best friend." I said, "I was, but not anymore. The Jews are leaving town."
Whoa.
His mother throws him a warm pair of boots, which saved him in the initial months. And the Jews are all taken to the marketplace, which was right in front of the church.
And
Most
this was
towns,
just the men and boys, right? Or who was this?
just the men and boys, but the women followed to see what was happening to their husbands. What most towns in Lithuania that I saw, that the main attractions of the town were the church and the synagogue. So they were basically the entrance to the town. Lokava has a new church, and I went there. They were extremely welcoming, but I didn't want to say to the mayor, who spent a couple hours with me, "By the way, the church you're so proud of, it was rebuilt. That's the place exactly where my grandfather was beaten, and my grandmother would have been watching the scene, sadly, and the townspeople were around there clapping, happy at what was going to happen to the Jews, because they knew they would take over their homes. They knew they would take over whatever businesses and whatever possessions they had."
It sounds so barbaric, but it scares me because I think it's the same mentality that we slid into the whole Black Lives Matter thing, where they've convinced themselves that anything bad that happens to, white people or whatever is justified, and this is a good thing.
It is a great analogy of today. And I think part of the problem with these movements is the parents aren't taking accountability and responsibility for their children. And that's one thing.
Before you continue, the one thing we definitely want to point out is when Russia came in, or when Hitler came in, the Germans, the Lithuanians, you were expressing how poor they were. And they were blaming that poordom on the rest of the world. You guys caused this, even though that we as Germans, we started World War I and we lost that war, and now we're paying reparations. The reparations were pretty heavy and causing a lot of grief on the Germans, the Lithuanians, and everybody else. And Hitler came in as a savior and said, "We're going to get out of this mess. We're going to lift everybody up." He had that positive attitude. He had that positive outlook. And it was contagious. He was a great orator. He was a great speaker. And the problem that people have, and we pointed this out earlier, is they want an enemy. They want someone to blame. They don't want to look inwardly. They don't want to look at themselves as part of the problem. It's our fault. They want to find blame outside somewhere. It's your fault. You did this. You caused this. They want to have that victim mentality, that poor me mentality, and we see that a lot nowadays. We see that amongst the more ghetto communities where they're justifying theft. We had 3 teenagers that were killed the other day and shot by a homeowner when they tried to break in at 4 o'clock in the morning, and their friends and neighbors are trying to justify, "You don't understand, they're raised in the ghetto. This is how they are. This is justifiable." And so they're trying to justify evil. And so when Hitler came in, the people were looking for some place to point a finger. And he pointed the finger at the Jews and said, "They did it, they caused it." And all of a sudden now there's a focal point for everybody's energy to go to. Everybody's hate, everybody's anger. And then just because one simple little narrative, the entire society turns on a dime and just latches onto that, and they're okay with the death. They're okay with people getting taken out and shot, men, women, and children. They all of a sudden is justified. And that's scary when the entire society as a whole turns to such evil, and all of a sudden, what they would have normally considered evil and wrong, all of a sudden now, because of the way the narrative was twisted or the way it was made them or was made to believe, all of a sudden now it's the right thing to do. And we're seeing that nowadays. We're seeing that in our universities, we're seeing that in our colleges, and all of a sudden is justifiable. All of a sudden what Hamas is doing to Israel is justifiable. And we're seeing the same mentality, it's the exact same mentality repeating itself.
There was an incident yesterday at 2 a.m. in Chicago of in as you turned to the ghetto area, the police were trying to break up a bunch of teenagers who were gathered in the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning, and a drive-by happened and someone shot 7 teenagers, one in serious condition, the others in fair condition. But my first reaction is, where are their parents? It is 2 o'clock in the morning. Where is a teenager? What is a teenager doing? It's no accountability. There is no accountability anymore in many of these areas. But Uriah, your point about the way Nazi Germany was indoctrinating the population was fantastic. And so let's go into a little bit of the history of it. So from 1933 on, Jews were demonized. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, created a situation where Germany had to pay the equivalent of $50 billion in reparations. There was hyperinflation, there was no food, there were no jobs, and they had to wait in bread lines. And if you could afford bread, you needed a wheelbarrow full of money to get it. So Germany is in a hyperinflation. They can't have conscription, they can't have an army. So what can you do? Either you look at it and you say, you know what, it's not my responsibility, someone else snitched on me, or you take accountability. And we see accountability doesn't exist in today's world in many, many communities. It's never their fault. It's always someone else's fault. And Jews were prominent, yet there were never more than 52,000 Jews in Germany. There were never more than a couple percent of the population. But everyone had a Jewish doctor and everyone had a Jewish lawyer. And so he said, education-wise, education is critical to the Jewish population. The Jewish high schools here have over 90% go to college. And that's very unusual. The Chicago Public School 8th grades graduate about 40% of kids who read at 8th grade level. But on the Jewish level, education is super important. And we emphasize that. So in Germany, when everyone knew a Jew, everyone knew the Jews were the librarians and the lawyers and the doctors, and they were very prominent in the population. And one of the things that made them prominent led to their downfall. But Hitler, sadly, as you said so correctly, he was a brilliant orator. And he knew that by targeting the Jewish population, everyone would be able to turn very quickly. And he did a phenomenal job, sadly, of creating an atmosphere where if you'd go to the cinema, if you go to a movie, which is a big event in Germany in the 30s, or old black and white films, and the preliminary wasn't of the other movies coming out. The preliminary was showing rats and rodents in the sewers and how corrupt and evil they were, comparing them to the Jews. And newspapers had caricatures of a Jew with a big nose and with a Star of David around their necks on a globe controlling the global economy. Jump rope games of girls had sing-songs of when Jewish blood spurts from the knife, all will go better. The most popular game in Germany in the 1930s was a child's Monopoly type game, where you had Jewish businesses of like Cohn's Bakery and Schwartz's grocery store and Goodman's jewelry store. And the object of the game was to kick 3 Jews out of their homes or businesses. And when you did that, you won the game. And that taught little kids that it's okay to hate Jews, that they're the enemy, that they snitched on us, and they were the reason we lost World War I, which was ironic considering that Jews fought for Germany in World War I. They were honored, and hundreds of officers and decorated army people. But sadly, it developed to the point where Jews were on the outs and outs. As relates to the Einsatzgruppen, one fact came out in a very clandestine way. how they did that. And as you said, how did ordinary people turn into murderers? And some of the people couldn't handle the murderers, so they doing the murders, and they would be the people who would gather the Jews into the trucks or send the Jews from the trucks into the pits where they were buried. But a pilot his plane was shot down over England in the middle of the war, and when he landed, they caught him with a backpack full of different things, and amongst them was a survival kit with morphine to dull the pain if he was injured, and a gold foil pack of pills. And they didn't know what it was. They brought it into a lab in England, and they found that they were a drug called Pervitin, which in essence is crystal meth. What crystal meth does is speed up your metabolism and destroy your empathy. The Einsatzgruppen, when they captured land, and the German army also, they supplied 35 million pills in the fall of 1941 to the German population. You didn't need a prescription. Women who wanted to nurse their children and stay up at night were taking Pervitin, which is poisoning their infants. If you needed to study all night for an exam, you took Pervitin because it kept you up. The Nazis were conquering up to 100 miles a day. Just to traverse 100 miles a day is one thing. They were conquering up to 100 miles a day through use of these drugs, which not only sped up their metabolism and they didn't need to sleep, it destroyed their empathy. And that's how they could kill hundreds and hundreds of people a day without feeling anything.
I
And
read
that was
about
how
that.
Hitler destroyed European
I actually
Jewry.
even saw a special on that where Hitler specifically wanted to find something that would essentially turn his soldiers into super soldiers, because he wanted them to sleep less and travel more. And the side effect was that it was less empathy. And so he used that like water. I mean, it was
Yeah.
rationed out every
That
single
was
day,
the
several
exact
times
name
a
of the
day.
show,
And
Hitler's
his
Super
soldiers were able
Soldiers.
to walk more, travel more, and then again the side effect was no empathy. They would shoot more and care less.
Yes, I mean the show was Hitler's Super Soldiers, and I think it's available on Xfinity on demand. But I mean he built an army, and they were doing things that were just beyond subhuman.
Well, going back to Lithuania, so you started out that Lithuania was like the trial to see what the local population would do. Kind of finish your thoughts on that as to what the local population did and what happened there in Lithuania.
So I don't want to say that every Lithuanian was anti-Jewish, because that's not the case. And one amazing thing that happened about right after I went in 2019, I do business trade shows in the suburbs here, and the daughter-in-law of the boss of the show was talking about the value system, which we were discussing earlier in America. And she goes, where I come from, they don't behave like that. I said, really, where are you from? She goes, Vilnius, Lithuania. You never heard of it. I said, I was there last week. So the value system, I think there were people who valued life and valued even their Jewish neighbors. And she said, wait a minute. And she says, I'll be back in a couple minutes. She goes to call her grandparents in Lithuania. She goes, my grandparents hid 7 Jews during the war. And other people in her town hid Jews and were caught and killed, which was a penalty for hiding Jews. So the adversarial relationship, there were still people who felt they needed to do what was right. And they stood up for what was right. And in Poland especially, the Polish population helped in the killing and murdering of at least 200,000 Jews. But on the other hand, conversely, there were hundreds of Polish people and Lithuanians who assisted in helping Jews hide and survive. And this is coming out more now than ever before post-war, because as these people are getting older, their stories are being told of their heroism. And I think that's so important for the youth of today to know that there are people who, no matter what the circumstance is, stand up for what's right and will say no. And when I went to Lokava, Lithuania, I was debating whether I could safely, I'm an Orthodox Jew, wears a yarmulke all the time. Could I wear that in Lithuania? And my attitude was, I'm trying to say it in a diplomatic way, I'm going to wear it. And if you're not comfortable with it, that's too bad. That's not my problem because my roots are in this town. And these are the streets that my father and my uncle and aunt, who I never knew, grew up playing. This is where my grandfather had a business. And so I made arrangements and I'd networked for over a year. And I networked a government worker from Vilnius and the cultural director of the Silel region, which was the region my father was from. And we all went to the town. And the first place in town I went to was the second Jewish cemetery, newer cemetery, without one gravestone. It was all stolen by the Russians. The second cemetery, which was the older one, my grandmother died in childbirth in 1927. We know the exact date she died. She sent a letter to her siblings in Chicago. Mazel tov, congratulations, I had a baby girl. And by the time the letter got there, she had died of complications. The baby died 17 months later. We don't even know the name of that baby. No one knew. No one remembered. And my father had a brother and sister who were, his brother was teaching in Kaunas. And his sister, my aunt, would have been my aunt, went to visit him. And they just were swept up with tens of thousands of other Jews in the ghetto and taken to a place called Fort 9 and murdered. But the population today is very different. And it's a controversial thing to say. And some of my friends totally disagree with me, saying that some of them will say, well, the population is the same. It's not the same. It's a different generation. So I networked and I went through the town and I met the mayor. And the mayor was incredibly welcoming. And I was just blown away. And I don't speak Lithuanian. He didn't speak English. I had a translator from Israel who was there with me doing the driving. And the translator said to him that Marshall didn't feel that I could safely walk around Lithuania with a yarmulke. You can lie with your words. You can't lie with your eyes. And the mayor looked at me and said, why can't you walk around with a yarmulke? You're more than welcome here. Your roots are here. Now, I'm not going to go and say to him, do you realize that 100 feet from where we're standing, my grandfather was beaten as your ancestors were clapping? It wasn't appropriate, and it's a different generation. And in Poland also, it's similar, where there's almost like a fascination with Jewish culture and life today. And there are festivals all over Poland and Krakow and in small towns called Wolodowo, where every summer they have festivals celebrating Jewish heritage and Jewish life that was. And there seems to be a fascination with it. The mayor took me through the town. I went to the synagogue and I knew exactly where the rabbi sat, where my father sat, and where his father sat. And the construction of synagogues then had many windows that went from floor up to waist level and higher because they needed the light, because it was very expensive to heat and have candles. So I was determined to break into the synagogue. I didn't want to end up in a Lithuanian prison, but I was determined to get inside. And I found out that the synagogue was owned by an older woman who used this as a tax write-off. And one of the windows, all the windows are boarded up, and one of them had a piece of wood in front of it, no glass, and I pushed the wood aside, and it opened up. And I looked at the mayor, and I made a motion, I'm going in, and he welcomed me in with his face, and I went in, and everyone went in for a little bit, and as Jews, we pray morning, afternoon, and evening, and 2 days in a row that I was there, I prayed the afternoon service where my grandfather sat and where my father sat. And I just spent probably a couple hours literally in the building. I don't even know the time, just lost in the vision of what was like. The Jewish population, you got 500 people. Even the people who weren't that observant went to services on Saturday. So imagine 400 or 500 people, and they would eat afterwards, and this one would bring food, and they had like a courtyard in front. And my guess is that women came with their strollers and their babies, and they met their husbands, and the townspeople all bonded together. it almost sounds like a utopian society, especially where the holidays come in, where they all were happy together. And they were not they weren't looking for an adversarial relationship with their neighbors. Sadly, the adversarial part came from the Lithuanian Gentiles, who were probably jealous of that. Last week, I went to a Jewish law class, and they were talking about conversions. And one thing that attracts many Gentiles to convert is the family element. The family unit of Jews is super important. And I think that's what caused the ire of a lot of the Lithuanian population. They didn't have that, and the Polish people didn't have that. And the Jews always had that Sabbath dinner concept of Friday night. Whether they were religious or not, so many of them have that unity, and and I think that's that spirit, and I have to say the rabbi of the town, whose name was Reb Chaim Zelik Kaplinsky, he unified the community in such an incredible way that every community member, however religious or observant or thoughtful they were of their religion, he brought them together and listened to them and spent time with them. And I think that was the success of all these hundreds and hundreds of small towns, that they had a cohesive community that cared.
I'm shocked at how much recovery happened from these communities, because it was a huge reversal. So at the following generations actually learned from the previous generations and actually changed. And that's not so prevalent. It's usually the next generation gets worse than the previous generation, not better. But war tends to do that. War tends to change a lot of minds and hearts and kind of reverse that thinking.
Right.
So
And I think people
back,
didn't want to go back to the war. They didn't
yeah,
want to go back to that situation anymore. And in Lithuania and in Poland, and I've been in Poland 4 times, in Lithuania once, I never really felt any level of anti-Semitism. I never felt that I wasn't well. Actually, there was one incident. The first time I was there, I was in Sabbath in Warsaw, and the maitre d' was an older man, and he was just sneering. He did not enjoy serving Jewish people, and I was just dying to go up to him, put my arm on his shoulder, and say, "We're back," but I didn't. So I held back. But for the most part, it's a different generation thing, and I think most people really want to live their lives, raise their families, and not have conflicts. The conflicts in the world today are people who don't want to live in peace. But I think most
or
people,
want something for nothing. They want. I mean, that's the problem with today's generation is the conflict starts from entitlement. The conflict starts from society owes me something, and I'm going to go out and get it. And that's where these protests are coming from. That's where the Black Lives Matter came from, where they were just destroying everything. It's that entitlement. Society owes me something. It's that same exact mentality that they had back then, where I'm not to blame. Somebody else created this problem. It's your problem. It's white privilege. It's the Jews created, whatever it is. It's finding fault with how your life is from any other angle than inwardly. And that
very
creates
true.
violence, because you want to go out and just take it. You're going to
It's
forcefully
a
go out
much
and take it.
easier way to have that mentality, Uriah, than having to do the work that it takes to solve your own problems and to rise above hardships and the trials that we all go through in life. It's just easier to be able to find fault with somebody else.
Yeah.
it's easy to blame the next guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing people just don't learn is life isn't fair. Get over it. You go through your battles, you go through your struggles, and you just become a stronger person, and you get over it. But a lot of people don't want to do that. They want everything now. I want my money. I want everything provided for me. I want everything now. And I'm not willing to wait for it. I'm not willing to earn it. Give it to me. That type of mentality is what caused the Second World War and the slaughtering of Jews. I mean, the second that Hitler pointed at a direction and said, this is the problem, everybody followed it. And if we had a leader all of a sudden come up with that same type of charisma nowadays and pointed a certain direction, there would be a lot of people just instinctively following that, scarily following that. And they would sit back and say, well, we're not repeating history. We wouldn't ever do what Hitler did. Hitler was evil. He was a monstrosity. We wouldn't go out and kill Jews. Yet they're repeating the exact same things, just towards a different population.
They have no clue what they're saying. When they yelled to the river, from the river to the sea, they have no clue what river. They have no clue what sea. 3 days after these two Israeli diplomats were killed in Washington, D.C., 10 days ago or so, there were about 125 protesters on Michigan Avenue in the heart of downtown yelling, "We don't want no two-state solution. We want 48," when the Israel borders were indefensible. So they're abundantly clear. We're not often listening to them well enough, but they really don't know what they're saying. And that was a danger. Hitler was able to convince the population. Joseph Goebbels was his propaganda minister, who did a phenomenal job of mass rallies. And often when I take groups to the museum, and in the third room in, there's a giant poster of a mass rally with signs that say, "When Jewish blood spurts from the knife, all is better, and Jews are our misfortune." So are you going to be the one person in those 50,000 people who are going to say, "Oh, no, you're wrong"? They'll trample you to death. And the power of suggestion and convincing the population didn't take much, because everyone wanted to be a member of the master race. Everyone thought it attractive to be considered the greatest society in the world when you don't have a job and you don't have money. But if you tell yourself enough that you're great, then you start to believe it, sadly.
Which is what makes the whole thing between Israel and Hamas scary, because what's happening in the universities is everybody's putting that full blame on Israel. Israel's doing it. Israel's killing everybody. Israel's slaughtering innocents. And they're not looking at the truth that Hamas started the problem. Hamas is one in there slaughtering men, women, and children, and raping. And it wasn't just Hamas soldiers. It was actually Palestinian citizens that crossed the border and started creating those slaughters. And yet people still want to deny that. I've seen Charlie Kirk get up on these universities, ask those type of questions, and there'll be people literally standing there saying, "No, Hamas didn't do that. Hamas didn't kill anybody. They're not doing anything like that. They just wanted to take some of their land back." And they will openly deny the atrocities because they want to believe them, not because they're true or not, because they want to believe them. And it's that desire to want to believe something even though it's wrong that creates the problem, because that's where society shifts. The entire society as a whole shifts on a dime, and you have a World War II Holocaust type scenario. And again, you look at modern media, you look at the girls on The View, you look at modern media, you look at the Democrat Party almost as a whole, at least the leadership, the congressional leadership and the senatorial leadership, and they'll all come and say, "Yeah, Hitler was evil. We would never do that to Jews. We're not anti-Semitic. We're not going to do any of those type of stuff." And yet the same almost verbatim rhetoric, almost the same exact storylines, the narrative that they're putting out is virtually identical to what Hitler did. And they will deny it till they're blue in the face that they're not doing that. And yet they are. You'll see what's going on in the universities where these huge protests against Israel, and they're, again, like you were just saying, chanting "river to the sea," and they have no idea what river or what sea. They just see something that the United States is supporting. They see a holistic country like the Jewish country, and they just want to burn it down. They want to destroy it. These same people are also very anti-Christian, and they want to see that burned to the ground. These same protesters are very, very anti-U.S., and if it wasn't such pariah to go out there and burn American flags, I guarantee every single one of those protesters would be burning American flags out there right along with burning the Israeli flag and protesting Israel, because they hate
Absolutely.
our own country just as much as they hate Israel. They just
And
know
we don't realize that.
the
Sadly,
media
we don't
wouldn't
realize
take
that.
well to that. The mass public wouldn't take well to that, so they're not doing it. But inwardly, you know for a fact that every single one of those protesters, if they thought they could get away with it, would be out there burning American flags.
Absolutely. They had a rally at the beginning of the war of about over 220 to 250,000, mostly Jews in Washington, D.C. There were American flags. There were Israeli flags. There wasn't one act of violence. The Palestinian protests, they break into buildings on Columbia University. They burn things. They beat people. And one of the policemen said leaving the rally, he had never been thanked by so many people in his entire career, because the Jews thanked him for giving security. And there wasn't one American flag burned. There wasn't one anti-American statement. We Jews are extremely, extremely thankful to America for the golden haven that it has become for the Jewish population. And the good people in Congress and whoever they may be stand up when there's anti-Semitism and they know what's wrong. And the truth is, whatever happens to the Jewish population eventually happens to the American population as well. They're going to come after the Jews, and if they were done with the Jews, these pro-Hamas people, they'd come in America just as well. They hate America just as much, but we're their first line of offense. But the Americans, the value system we have and the freedom we have in their society, I mean, if they don't like it here and they don't like America, you know something, I'm sure there are plenty of people who would be glad to fly them to Gaza or fly to Iran. See what your human rights discussions will happen there.
That's a good point, because in the universities, a lot of these youth that they're ignorant. They just want to be part of something big. It's their first, shot at adulthood away from mom and dad. They're not sure what they're shouting for, what they're protesting, but they have no idea that they are the very people who would be killed that Hamas hates.
Yeah. Dennis Prager, I don't know if you ever listened to him.
Yes.
He says the craziest group, and I'm not anti anybody. If everyone wants to live their lives quietly and peacefully, good, fine. Just, don't impose your values on me. But he was saying on radio, he said, queers for Palestine are the oddest group, because what they don't realize is if they would go to Gaza and they would be found to be queer or anything similar, they would be thrown off a building. And yet they're protesting. Like, people need to think. What are you doing? What are you saying? There aren't human rights in all of these countries. In Iran, if a woman goes and shows her ankle, she's beaten. I mean, what kind of value system is this? What we want to live under? And Jews are very into being modest and dressing modestly for the most part. But if someone doesn't, if we're normal, we're certainly not going to yell at them and beat them.
Right.
We have and on a Christian level and on a Jewish level, we have value systems that are critical to who we are as people. And those are the systems we give to our children and grandchildren. And those are the systems that we, and I think as an American society, for the most part, wants for their world. I deal with a lot of Palestinians for work. And my friends asked me, like, how is it? I said, they're wonderful people. They want to raise their families. And they're here in Chicago because they don't want to live like that. They don't want to live with their kids carrying machine guns and learning to hate. They want their kids to grow up to be valuable, positive people in their communities and positive examples and role models. And I think for the most part, that's the value system that most of the world espouses for without, looking to destroy other populations or protest. I don't go to these protests. I have no desire to go. I've never gone. I don't want to sit there and shout. We had a friend growing up. We used to go to these every Sunday protests downtown, yelling across the street at Palestinians and Palestinians yelling. I don't think anything accomplishes of that. I have friends who I do business trade shows with, and people who I deal with day to day, and I see their kids and I see the way they're raised, and they want only good things. They want their kids to be educated. They want their kids to grow up. And I think these college campuses are turning, people from fairly conservative families into crazy liberals where they don't even know what they're saying. and Israel's the occupier, and Israel's the Nazi state, and Israel says, investigate the facts. Look what you're doing. Think for yourself, and ask questions. Ask hard questions, and investigate. The Chicago Tribune always talks about, X amount of people are killed, but it includes all the terrorists. And they talk about allegations, and they're so sided against Israel. Uriah, you have a phenomenal viewpoint of what's going on in the world in the Middle East, and both of you do. And that's so appreciative. And on a Jewish level, we appreciate that support, and it's so important. At my synagogue, all the time, Sabbath morning, when I walk in, I talk with a security guard. And he also, similar viewpoints. When you think clearly and investigate, then you get to the real facts.
And that's why so many, most of our faith, different denominations, we have all those same values together. And instead of picking apart what our differences in, Uriah always says, we all believe killing's bad. We all believe the family is the most important nuclear unit. We all believe that faith is important. We need to be more united as different faiths in fighting these political movements and joining together when it comes to voting and information and joining those things that matter most, instead of worrying about what our differences are. And are we educating our children on these value systems so that they're not being indoctrinated as easily in the elementary school, in the junior high, in the high school, in college?
Well,
we
not
also
being
need
afraid
political
to
leaders
be
who will stand
pretty
up for what's right.
strong with your teaching your children, because you know that when they go out to society, they're going to face this indoctrination. It's going to happen. There's too many conservatively raised Christian children that are leaving their homes and just phenomenal kids, and then 3 years later, 4 years later, they come out of college, complete 180. It's a complete reversal, and their Christian values, their conservative values are just gone. And they've taken in hook, line, and sinker everything that was taught there in the university. That's complete indoctrination. It's not true. It is not real. And they'll come out and you'll see them, and they are adamant that, no, what I'm saying is true. And they'll argue with you because they want to be right. They want this to be right. And it's not about searching it on their own and coming up with their own education and coming up with their own truth and just trying to find the truth. It's, I'm right, you're wrong, and I'm going to argue my point of view no matter what happens. And it's that pride that leads to your downfall, because you're not willing to accept the truth. And when the truth is staring you in the face, you're still not willing to accept it. I mean, I want to do a quick comparison. I mean, look at the similarities between now and what is happening, or what did happen at the time of Hitler. Hitler found an enemy. He found a common group of people that he considered evil, and he started pointing people to that evil, which was the Jewish population. And then he used these great narrations, these great storylines, and convinced the populace that those groups are evil. And then how he did that was he started nitpicking them apart and saying that they're a cult, that they're stealing from you, that they're oppressing you. And he used that victimization, that victim mentality, to where people felt like they were the victim, that they were being oppressed, that they do have wrongs committed against them, that it is generational wrongs that have been committed against them. Where have we heard those narratives before? What's happening against the white community now, that there's almost a complete reversal of racism now? What's happening with the MAGA movement? How is the MAGA movement being painted as a cult, as an oppressor, as
they're calling them Nazis. They call us Nazis.
Yes. How ironic.
Yes, how ironic and brilliant, really.
It's the exact same thing. If you don't think that those narratives are identical, that history is repeating itself, then you're purposely shielding your eyes and just not looking. It's the exact same thing happening right now, and it's being fed by Democrat leadership, it's being fed by the media, and it's being fed by our university professors. And they're indoctrinating the next generation, and it's an exact repeat of what happened in the time of Nazi Germany. It's
Look,
identical.
it is shocking when Elise Stefanik, the congresswoman from New York, she is an incredible mouth to her. And when she was grilling the college professors, like, is calling from the river to the sea genocide against the Jewish people, is that allowed on your campus? They don't give answers. And these are answers to things that have to be answered. But I want to quote for a second Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of England, who was a brilliant and eloquent orator. And he spoke once at the synagogue I go to, and they opened up the social hall, and there must have been 1,000 people to listen to him. And he is just one of those. I mean, he could probably read his grocery list, and it sounded wonderful, especially in an English accent. And he said that biblically, when Abraham buried Sarah and sat the Shiva, the 7-day mourning period for her, and then the next thing he did was go to find a wife for Isaac. He built the next generation. The love of his life was gone, and he went to build the next generation. He didn't focus on his needs. He went to build that next generation. And then he kind of hesitated, and he said, and other groups that were slaves over 200 years ago have never built the next generation. So the Holocaust survivors who came out focused on their children and their families' lives and building them. And they were suffering. Joseph Aronovitz, who I spent many hours with, his daughter told me he used to scream in the middle of the night in nightmares. And Holocaust survivors say anytime they walk on the streets, they would look behind them, afraid of who was behind them. But the Jewish people post-Holocaust very successfully built lives. The head of the Chicago Mercantile, I think his name is Leo Malamed, I'm not sure. He was a Holocaust survivor. You see heads of corporations, people, doctors, lawyers, successful businessmen. Life is full of obstacles, and how we deal with them as human beings is critically important, not only for us, but what we teach our family and what value system we give our communities, and our families are reflecting in how we respond to adversity. Look, many Holocaust survivors never were whole again, and yet they have families. So, and I think it's a testament to the leadership, and this is where a lot of communities fail in America. The leadership of the Jews, for instance, the rabbi from local Lithuania, who made sure, they said shepherds always made good leaders of the Jewish people throughout the early years, because they cared for every sheep. And if one sheep goes astray, you run after it. And if one person, whoever they may be, a child or an adult, needs help, a leader has to be attentive to the needs and address it.
We have that exact same thing in the Bible. I mean, if you lose the one, you go out and find it. I mean, Jesus Christ always taught that. If you have 100 sheep and you lose the one, you go out and find the one. Well, let's get into some of these stories. I mean, I've got a lot of points I want to make about ethics and values, and we're going to make that as we go along here. But I want to get into some of these real history here. So let's start off with one. How you got into it first. You're young, you're a teenager, and you're starting to get into these first histories. So kind of walk us through how you grew up, how you got into these first histories, the very, very first interviews that you ever did, and then walk us through a few of those interviews and a few of those experiences.
Okay, I'm glad to do it. Thank you for the opportunity. So my father passed away in 1978. I was 18, and we started looking through some drawers at home, and my mother never knew these letters existed, but there were letters back and forth in Yiddish, which my mother spoke and helped us translate, of the dire situation of the Jews in Lithuania in 1941. And we didn't know where to go with this. And I said, Ma, what was this baby who was born in 1927? What was her name? She died 17 months later. She goes, I don't know. I never asked. And we started looking for answers, and we didn't know where to turn. And then we found out that the person who had told my father what happened to his family, Joseph Aronovitz, who made an incredible impression on my life, lived a few miles away from us. And I called him up and I got to know him a little bit. And my brother came in from school in the summer, and we decided we were going to ask him nicely if he would spend a couple days with us and tell his experiences. In July of 1983, we spent 6 hours on audio cassette tapes, flipping them every 45 minutes. To the newer listeners, cassettes were just like a reel-to-reel little self-contained thing. I since had them digitalized. And we spent 6 hours with him over 2 days. This is before the Steven Spielberg Foundation had taped 58,000 survivors. And Mr. Aronowitz and his wife both did that Spielberg Foundation. And on a side point, I believe Spielberg was successful in his life in movies so he could establish this foundation. There are reasons for why people do what they do. And he started going through, and my brother just told me a couple of days ago, he said the second day when we came back to finish another couple hours, he said it took a lot out of him physically to tell this over. But the first story, he told us a little bit about the town, 2,000 people, 500 Jews. He told me about my great-grandfather, who I was named after, about my grandfather, my uncle and aunt, who we never knew. But he told one story that just blew me away. And I want to go through it, and I have it transcribed. And he said that when the Jews were taken out of Lokava, they were taken to a city called Sveksna. And Sveksna was a small town that had a Jewish study hall. And the Jews were in trucks. The men and boys were in trucks. And they took Joseph Aronowitz's brother Zelig, a man named Shapiro and a man named Avram Gershon, to the wall of the study hall and then shot them. And then they left for a town called Matzdubern, which is known as Luftstalag 4, which later became an Allied airmen who'd been captured prison camp. And the Jews worked there in July of 41, late June and July of 41, 14 hours a day from the dark of the morning until night. They dug canals, which was very difficult for older Jews, and they were beaten often. There was little food. They received a piece of bread a day and some soup. And they were loading up grain. They would often take some and tie up their pants and put the grain in and hide the grain. And they had a small coffee grinder. And when they returned to camp, they would grind the grain and use the heater, to make food. Some were caught and beaten to death. But at this camp, they were marched out daily for forced slave labor to dig the canals. And in Lithuania today, there are a lot of fields and it rains a lot. So the canals were dug like a couple of feet deep and about 2 feet wide to gather the water. You can still see them today. And as I passed them, I'm thinking, like, which one did my grandfather work on? Which did the rabbi work on? Which did Joseph Aronowitz work on? But many times they were marched out in groups, and they would pass farms and homes. And some of the farmers, to their credit, some of the Lithuanians would leave food out and sacks of potatoes and bread for the Jewish slave laborers to grab and eat on the way, which helped them survive. One man, Joshua Dorfman, was in his late 30s or early 40s. He somehow went out of line and went to a German woman on a farm, and he begged for food. She gave him bread, pig meat, which we generally don't eat, but you're starving, eggs, and other food. And this woman goes afterwards to the Gestapo to report that she had given food to a Jew. She didn't want to be caught and killed. So the German penalty was death if you give food or aid a Jew. The commandant of the camp, the commander of the camp, was a Mr. Sau. He was later convicted after admitting to killing 200 Jews. Mr. Aronowitz told me he killed at least 2,000, and West Germany sentenced him, sadly, to only 15 years in prison. Mr. Sau lined up all the Jews, asked them who took food from a woman farmer. No Jew was willing to admit that they had taken food, nor tell who had taken the food, and only a few Jews knew who had taken the food. The Jews were forced to stand outside for 24 hours. No Jew went to work that day, and they were forced to run outside the camp for hours. In late fall, it was wet and cold, some of the men in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and they would fall, and they were beaten by the Nazis, get up again and fall again. The Nazis announced that if they're not told right away who took the food, they'll take 10 people out and shoot them. Every day afterward, they would kill 10 extra Jews until they found out who did it. When no one would tell who took the food, they called in the woman who gave Joshua Dorfman the food. She pointed him out to Mr. Sau, and they said they were going to kill him right away, Joshua Dorfman, but they didn't. the history of humanity always focuses on people who stood up for what's right. And Manis Kagan was a Jew from the small shtetl, the small town of Lokava. He was in his early 40s, and he was the captain of the Lithuanian army, which was highly unusual for a Jew to attain. He was taken from Lokava with the men from the town, and he was in Matstubern, where in the slave labor camp, and he was the Elster or overseer at work. He spoke fluent German, and his job was to report to the Germans if anyone was not doing their job properly. He never said a bad word about another Jew. He would never snitch. The Nazis approached Manis Kagan and said he needs to whip Joshua Dorfman 25 times in his behind. And Manis wasn't very familiar with Joshua. They didn't know each other well, but he refused. And the Nazis said, if you don't beat Joshua, we will whip you. He said, okay, whip me. The Nazis beat him up. They asked him if he would now whip Joshua Dorfman. Again, he refused. They told him if he didn't do it, he'd be buried alive. They gave him a spade. He had to dig his own grave for a few hours, and they told him to crawl in. Jews are forced to cover him up with dirt, and while standing in his own grave so that he was buried up to his neck, they asked him if he was going to whip Joshua. And again, he refused. They offered him time to decide. He said he didn't need any time to decide and he won't do it. They left him in the grave for a few hours, still alive. The Nazis ordered the Jews to finally take him out of the grave, and they beat him again. Dr. Sau and some of the Nazis told him that if a Jew could have so much pride in himself and not to care for his own life, just not to beat up another Jew, people like that are indestructible. And Mr. Aronovitz described Manis as a man with a heart filled with love and great Jewish pride who would sacrifice his life anytime for another Jew. He was not one of the more observant, tremendously observant Jews, but he was traditional and he loved his fellow people. He arrived in Birkenau in late May or June 1943. He saw what was happening, and he went crazy. He couldn't handle mentally what was happening. He saw the ovens, and he was taken to the gas chambers. But the pride that he had, that he refused to beat another person, is incredible. And that kind of spirit is pretty unusual, even on that level. But that's the kind of spirit that I think you get when you have a leader, a rabbi in the community, or a Jewish communal leader who instills in you a pride of who you are. And I don't know if there were any survivors of him, but I know that Mr. Aronovitz had many, and we can talk about some of his personal events, but he lived 65 years post-war. And a time, and I counted 3 or 4 different times when he was 3/4 dead. And yet he pulled himself up. And one of the times there was a death march at the end of the war, and he fell. He had pleurisy, and he had typhus and lice all over him, and he fell down. And 2 of my cousins, I found out they were cousins before I went to Israel the first time, and after he told me, after I interviewed him, he gave me the phone numbers and addresses of 7 people from Lokava that lived in Israel. I interviewed them all, and I met with them. And 2 of them were my cousins. When he fell on the death marches, they were marching out of Birkenau at the end of the war to try to kill them in the mountains. He fell down. And Aryeh and David Goldfuss picked him up and said in Yiddish, "Let's outlive them." And they had a mentality that they were going to get through. And he said it was because the rabbi of the town instilled in him a fierce pride and a value of life. And he lived another 65 years. And he told me another time he was in a camp called Allach. It was in Germany. There was no gas chamber, but there was an oven. He was so sick, he had fallen into a coma. And they didn't need to do anything except just dump him in the ovens. And he's on a conveyor going into the ovens. And I tell this story over at the diorama of Crematoria 4 at the Holocaust Museum here whenever I do tours there. And he falls off the conveyor headed into the oven. And he says, "Just my lot in life to fall in the hands of this Nazi murderer." And he spells his name in the air, M-A-H-L, Mal. And Mal takes his body to force him back on the conveyor, and he feels a faint pulse. The Nazis loved medical experiments. How could you have a pulse when you're dead? They took him into the infirmary, quote unquote, fed him adrenaline, pumped him with adrenaline, coffee, and caffeine. 3 days later, he woke up. And everyone had said he was dead. And he lived another 65 years in a productive life. I have a set of the Torah, the Bibles that he gave me for my bar mitzvah when I was 13. And I cherish it beyond because it's a connection to him. His daughter, his grandchildren, I know them here and I'm friendly with them. His son is actually going to Lithuania at the end of the month. I've been in touch with him. But look at the difference one person made. Look at the difference Oskar Schindler made when he saved 1,200 people. There are over 6,000 descendants when they made Schindler's List. And I think that the incredible moral that I take out of it is that individual people had God pulling them aside and say, your job in life isn't done. You've got a lot to live for. And I'm going to make sure that you're going to have a productive life and children and grandchildren who are going to be doing amazing things in the world. Whether it's a doctor, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's a Bible teacher, whatever it is. And there was one man who I knew in the community who used to get reparations from Germany that for his suffering, and he was a cabinet maker for the Nazis. And when he would get reparations, he would take that check and not deposit it in his bank. He would sign it over to the Jewish private school that his grandchildren went to, pay to the order of Ari Crown Hebrew Day School, and he would say, they're going to pay for my grandchildren's education. And those kind of stories, when I started and I heard them, just sent me on a one-way street of learning the Holocaust and studying and reading and reading. I took Evelyn Wood's speed reading, and I was reading 50 Holocaust books a month for a couple months until I overdosed and just had to back up a little bit. And even now, when I watch movies, I watch Holocaust-oriented movies of heroism. I read Holocaust books. A friend of mine tells me I take my vacations at death camps. So I think for me, it was a one-way street of seeing, and to me, the fascination is what makes individuals stand up for what's right. Why are there bystanders and why are there upstanders? Why are there people in the time of horrible situations stand up to help their neighbors? Why are there people who stand by and watch and clap as my grandfather was being beaten, yet in the same town, there was a woman who hid Jews? And I think some of it is what we get from our families. Some of it is what we get, the value system. There was a woman named Irina Sendler who was a social worker in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the first days of it, before the Nazis realized this glitch, the courthouse that exited into the Polish side of Warsaw also bordered into the Jewish ghetto. And Irina Sendler realized she could take Jewish children out, and she saved 1,000 children. She placed them in Polish homes. She kept the information of each child in a large jar that she buried underneath the church. And she was caught by the Nazis and beaten. She refused to reveal any of her people she worked with, and she saved 1,000 children. And when I taught at Ida Crown, the local Jewish high school, this course, and I assigned projects for kids to do, and one of the girls, with a couple of girls, did an amazing project on Irina Sendler on one of the rescues, and they said, and I didn't know this, and they researched that Irina Sendler's father was a doctor, and he treated poor Jews who didn't have money and didn't charge them. When you see that, there's a phrase in Judaism, and I'll say it in Hebrew and I'll translate, Masei avot siman labanim. The acts of the father is a sign for the children. When you see your father treating people in need and treating them with dignity, that creates an impression that is lifelong. And there is no matching that value system. And I think those who didn't have that value system lost out. And those are the people who are
even nowadays, people are just losing that value system left and right. I mean, you look at that man that lived 65 years. He was meters from death at going into a furnace, happens to fall off, and instead of getting shot on the spot or put back on the conveyor, something convinced this murdering German soldier to experiment on him, and then steroids and whatever else they filled him up with kept him alive, which made him survive another 65 years. I mean, every single step of that is an absolute God-sent miracle. In a time where you're at your absolute worst, inevitability is at the door. This is it. I'm done. I'm gone. I'm going to be seeing God here in a few seconds. And all of a sudden, you get yanked from that and you get kept alive. And that's just a tremendous story. Not everybody got that story. I mean, a lot of people kind of fall into that guilt of, well, who got to pick and choose between who lived and who died. I mean, not everybody got that huge of experience. But you have to kind of look at the positive within the negative. And just like you're saying, every single one of us is born with a certain set of ethics and values. And we feel like those are God-fearing ethics and values, something you gain from your belief in God. And a lot of people are trying to convince us that God is not necessary. You don't need him in your life to have ethics and values. If you don't have that, you will get swayed by society. Just like what happened with the Lithuanians, when push comes to shove, when the masses start accepting a certain thing as the right thing to do and it's the wrong thing to do, like a Holocaust and slaughtering Jewish people, or having a massive acceptance of racism and the opposite racism, or racism in any direction for that matter, when all of a sudden society as a whole starts pulling in one direction, people tend to swing that direction. And their morals and values swing right along with it. It changes with the opinion of society. And when you have morals and values that are sustained in God, it doesn't matter what society does. It doesn't matter what the majority opinion is or what the appearances are on media or any place else, because appearances can be deceiving as well. It doesn't matter what the swing is. It doesn't matter what the common opinion is. It doesn't matter what anything is. If you have those morals and values based in your belief in God, they will not change. And they do not change, and they should not change. It doesn't matter what anybody else does. Right is right and wrong is wrong, period. And that should not be persuaded, moved, budged in any direction. And if you do not have that, this is how we have swing states, right? Because there are certain groups of people that just kind of go with the wind. They just kind of get persuaded both ways, and they kind of want to be that happy-go-along, make everybody happy, let's all get along type of a thing. And I'm not saying that those people who believe in God don't get along, but at the same time, we don't budge, we don't move. This is wrong, and I'm not budging from it. Like, let's point out abortion, or racism, or big government, or socialism, or communism. Any of these huge topics, or illegal immigration, where the entire society can get affected by, and the voting population can get completely turned. And it's not to be evil or cruel against a certain population. We need to keep our standards the same, and that type of mass influx is just not sustainable. But any of those topics, abortion or communism or socialism, any of those type of things is wrong. And it doesn't matter how you paint the picture, it doesn't matter how you beautify it, it doesn't matter how you spin it to make it look better, it doesn't matter, it's still wrong. And if you don't have those morals based in God, then anything that social media says, anything that Hollywood says, anything that the masses seem to say, you're just going to get swayed right along with it, and your morals and values, your base is just going to move right along with everybody else's. And that's essentially not having morals and values because you just kind of move with the populace. And that's what created the Holocaust is everybody just kind of moved and accepted what the masses were doing, which was genocide.
I think it's amazing that the value system that perseveres from generation to generation is a pure one. And these value systems and these isms that come and go don't last because something which is, I remember I was taught in high school and in college time that something which is pure and filled with value endures from generation to generation. Something which is not a value that is important to society does not last. And that those values that we bring up our families with and our communities with are eternal, and they should be eternal. And the values that aren't ones that make it through the generations are the ones that don't have that value system attached to them. And I think that's what, the rabbi was able to instill in his congregants. And every person I talked to had a fierce response of love for their communal leader. And I think that's what we're missing today in many of the communities is that we don't have leadership. We don't have government officials who are respectful and respected at all. And I think we'd be a much better country if we had people who really shined as examples to us.
So you're young, you're 18, 19, I guess it was, when you started hearing these first stories. How did that affect you personally when you started to hear these stories, and how did that give you that fever, that drive to collect more?
That's a great question. So it instilled in me a desire to find out more, and I don't think it was guilt. We all felt we never asked my father more about life in Lithuania. But then after I talked to Joseph Aronovitz, and I was like 22, 23, I went backpacking the next summer through Israel, finding all these townspeople and hearing their stories. And just hearing their stories and what value they put on day-to-day life was incredible. And if you'll allow me, I'll tell some of those occurrences.
I want to hear several of them. Go ahead.
Okay, so the first person I went to in Israel is named Abba Halperin. He lived in the city of Bnei Brak. And you could tell he was very religious by the way he dressed. And I called up and I said, I'd like to meet you. Very welcoming. And I didn't know much about him. I didn't want to know about it. I wanted to hear his story. And he knew my father well. He remembered the day my grandmother passed away. And he remembered seeing her body being prepared for burial, which was just eerie. And I felt a kinship that I'd never felt before with my family because I knew so little about it. And I asked, I had taken a picture of the rabbi of the town, Rabbi Chaim Zelig-Kaplinsky, and my father had brought a picture of him from Lithuania, but it was all broken up. Pictures then were on hard cardboard mounted, and I brought it to a local photographer. And when I came back a week later, this is I think in early 1980s, so I was like 21, 22, and an old Russian Jewish man was touching up the photograph. He goes, I fell in love with this picture. Tell me about him. And I didn't know much about him, but I said, I'm going to find out. So I set up a whole list of questions to ask these 7 survivors. And I go first to Abba Halperin. And he's telling me how the rabbi gave them strength on a day-to-day basis. He was a communal leader who took care of every sheep in his flock. And I asked him different questions. He ended up, God rewarded him. He worked very hard. He comes to Israel, and he, post 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, he starts bringing disposable plates and cups to Israel and becomes a wealthy man. And I developed quite a close relationship over the years. But the one thing that more than anything that impressed me about him was I asked him if he ever prayed. Religious Jews pray 3 times a day. And on Sabbath, there's a 4th prayer. And he said, I never missed one prayer service in all the years. Oh my God. Oh, what? How? You're starving. I said, the holidays, they're more complicated services. They're different. And he said, this one remember this part and this one remember this phrase. And we would mumble it under our breaths and we would say it in unison whenever the Nazis weren't around. And I remember he said, and I remember his exact words, I never skipped one prayer service all the years. Once I heard that, I knew I had to find out much more. And that was the continuation of the one-way street, but I got to know him fairly well over the years. And I called him before every Jewish holiday to wish him a good holiday. And he always answered on the first ring until one time he didn't answer. And it was about 14, 15 years ago. My son was studying in school in Israel, and he decided to join the Israeli army. And I said, and I'm incredibly proud that he did. I wasn't a fan in the beginning, but I'm super, super proud of his accomplishments. And I said, before you go in, I want you to go to Abba Halperin, and I want him to bless you that you come out safe. What bigger blessing could you have from someone who endured for our faith and people, who endured day-to-day suffering for 5, 6 years? And he put his hands on my son's head, and I was absolutely an emotional wreck in tears. And that experience with Abba Halperin, and I'll tell you some of the other experiences with others, was incredibly powerful in my life. I went to one.
Well, tell us a little bit about what he went through. Do you have some of his stories of what he went through?
So he had been through the same work detail. He had been through Matzdubern, and he had worked digging ditches. And then he ended up in Auschwitz for Birkenau for a number of years, doing slave labor. They would smooth out ground level to make streets. They would dig sewer ditches. They would move rocks and clear out for building buildings. They would do cement work. They would build barracks. And on Sundays, when the Nazis were off, they would be forced to move rocks just from place to place just to keep them busy. He did a lot of grading of the soil and digging ditches and hard slave labor from sunup to sundown. And he said it was work.
Tell any stories of being in Auschwitz, of what it was like being next to the gas chambers and the furnaces, because you know what was going on in that community at the time.
So I will like coordinate a bunch of the stories from them. When they got to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they would go to different, some ended up in different camps. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest, and I've been there 3 times. It was the largest of all the death camps in Poland. There are 2 unique schools of thought as to why the death camps were in Poland. One, and I'm not sure which is right, I'm leaning toward number 1, which was that the Polish population, for the most part, didn't object to those gas chambers being in their midst. Opinion 2 is that they put it there because there were 3,300,000 Jews in Poland before the war, and it was just logistically easier to put the death camps in Poland where the Jews were. Poland also had a large train network, and the Jews, part of their slave labor, Joseph Rollins built the train tracks going into Birkenau that the trains carried over 1.2 million people to be murdered there. So part of the work they did was in building up Birkenau, which was decided to build in January of 1942 at the Wannsee Conference in Wannsee, Germany, where the Nazis decided it wasn't efficient the way they did in Lithuania to kill Jews by bullets, and they would kill them in mass gas chambers. So first they used Auschwitz I, which is called Auschwitz itself, which was originally a prison of war camp, and that had a gas chamber of about 800 people. And they used Zyklon B, which was a pellet that was basically a rat killer. And it was a pellet that, when hit a degree temperature of 56 degrees, would turn into gas. The Jews would be put in the gas chambers. The doors were locked, and the doors were made by a Topfen company, TOPF. They made ovens, and they prided themselves on putting their name on gas chamber doors with peepholes. And the gas chambers had vertical cages, and the Zyklon B was put in from above by Nazi officials, and it hit very quickly to that 56 degrees, and it crystallized, it went from crystals into gas. And it was a human pyramid at the end of 45 minutes. The bottom were the older people who had less lung capacity, and the top were the children. In Auschwitz, in the gas chamber, you can see claw marks today. The prisoners being gassed must have clawed into the ceiling, into the concrete. It's eerie. It's horrible. It's intense. There are no words to describe it. But that wasn't enough for the Nazis. So the Nazis built Birkenau, which had 4 gas chambers with 2,000 people and a barracks to hold 2,000 people each, and a barracks to hold 200,000 people. So when Mr. Aronowitz and Abba Halperin came to Birkenau, there was like an area where they acclimated you into the camp immediately to the right side of the camp in a barracks. And then you ended up doing slave labor in 30 sub camps. Jews were involved in helping the German space program. They wanted to build a sphere of sorts that would be almost like a spaceship, like an alien spaceship that would be able to land vertically, so they could land weapons and artillery and men in different countries without having to have a runway. So Jews were involved in the experimentation of how they would respond to oxygen at high levels up in the sky. Jews were involved in building of the Farben plant, which made explosives. They were doing a lot of different slave labors in 30 different subcamps all around Birkenau. Day-to-day life, food-wise, they got a cup of, Mr. Aronowitz described it as like mud, black mud. They called coffee in the morning. Watery soup for lunch. We were lucky if you got a potato. And for dinner, they had a piece of bread with a chunk of butter or margarine if they were lucky. And they were doing slave labor, and they were suffering, and they were dying. And the conditions were such that in each row of the barracks, there were wood barracks, 3 tiers high. Each row had 7 people. Blankets were rare, and there were heaters in each barracks because, ironically, according to German law, you have to have a heater in every location where people are living. But they were never lit and heated. And in the winter, it was freezing. The conditions were horrible. And the bodies were being taken mostly when the trains would come through Birkenau. It would come through an opening in the Birkenau structure. And twice I've been at the upper part. Now it's hard to get into unless you pay for a study guide tour, a private guided tour. But twice I've been in the upper berth of the train station where the Nazi guards would see the trains coming through. And the trains would come to Birkenau. They would, and sometimes there were trips between 3-4 hours and up to a week from Greece to get to Birkenau. And they would come out, and the Nazi guards would be there with German shepherds and Raus, Raus, out, out. And women and children were on one side and men were on the other side. And I'm hesitating to use the word doctor because he was a savage butcher, but Joseph Mengele would separate right, left. And right usually meant you went to the gas chambers. Left meant you stayed alive. He would search out twins. He operated and did brutal medical experiments on over 150 sets of twins and on pregnant women, trying to figure out how to breed genetically a perfect human being. Excuse me. And there were women who were sterilized in brutal experiments. Within the gas chamber structure, there were 2,000 people at once, and the Sonderkommando was a unit of Jews forced to deal and process the bodies and deceive them and saying, put your clothing on a hook. Remember your hook number, because when you come out, you're going to take your clothing and your shoes again, tie your shoes together. There was like an ante room where they would undress, and they went in and they thought they were going to be taking a shower, and they were gassed. And the Sonderkommando had to send their clothing, which was sent to an area of the camp called Canada, which was named because Canada was a country associated with great wealth. Or they thought it was great wealth at that time. And the Sonderkommando would be having afterwards to take apart the bodies. Any gold teeth, the mouths were forced open and gold teeth were removed. Gold was an essential element of the Nazis' war because you need a lot of money to fight and pay your soldiers and to feed them. And they sold hundreds of kilos of gold to the Swiss country of Switzerland, which were independent and neutral. There is no neutral when you're buying Nazi gold. And any gold that was stolen from the Jews, gold, rings, diamonds, etc., was sold. And I'm sure there were many, many corrupt Nazis who absconded with a lot of money from what they stole. And this is prevalent really all over Europe, even in the mass graves of the Einsatzgruppen in Lithuania. The Lithuanian population, as soon as they found out there were mass graves there, the Gentile population would dig up the graves and search into the Jews' pockets for any possessions or gold or valuables. But within Birkenau, even within that situation, there were nothing short of angels that helped the situation. There were capos who were Jewish police to oversee, and there were better ones, and there were not so better ones. But one woman, Dr. Giselle Pearl, phenomenal movie about her called Out of the Ashes, she would find pregnant women, and she aborted over 1,000 babies to save their lives, because they knew if they would find a pregnant woman that she would be killed instantly by the Nazis. She ended up surviving the war, and I saw the area where she worked by the latrines, and she would abort the fetuses and say, "I'm saving your life." That was not an easy thing, and she had a trouble immigrating into America because she worked with Mengele, and they thought she cooperated with Mengele. And she goes, "I was saving lives. They were instantly going to be killed if they were found out to be pregnant." And she saved over 1,000 female women, who were pregnant. And when she came to New York, finally she got through and she was able to convince them that she was doing the right thing to save them. She opened an office in New York, and one pregnant woman who had remarried post-war, it was her second pregnancy, walks in New York, sees Dr. Giselle Pearl, and goes in and says, "Do you remember me?" And of course she did. And she said, "You're going to deliver my baby." And every time Dr. Pearl would deliver a baby, she would hold the baby up and say, "A life for a life." She ended up moving to Israel. There's a woman I'm very close with, Rachel Meir, who worked in Shaare Zedek Hospital, and Dr. Pearl worked there, and she knew her. So even within the worst of the worst, you had parents who gave their rations of bread to their children. You had women who worked to save humanity and to save women who ultimately would go on to have families. And there were many stories of things and people in Birkenau and who stood out. And one of them was a rabbi who came to Chicago post-war, was Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Meisels. And he, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, they took hundreds and hundreds of boys and they set up a T pole, and you had to reach the level of the T, and if you did, your life was saved. But if you were shorter than that, you were killed. And Rabbi Meisels saw that many of the boys who were short were trying to inch up on their tippy toes and try to reach the pole, and they were beaten to death on the spot. He ended up seeing that 1,400 boys were locked in a special barracks, and they were going to be gassed at nightfall. There were people who were bargaining with the capos, the Jewish police overseers, to try to redeem their children. One man from Oberlin, Poland, went up to Rabbi Meisels and said, "I have the wherewithal and the valuables to redeem my only son. Rabbi, I need to know, can I redeem my son? Because if they pull out my son, the count will be one short, and they will pay with their lives. I have the wherewithal to redeem my son, but before they will let him go, they will grab another Jewish child to be killed. Am I allowed to redeem my son, knowing that another person will be earmarked for death because of my actions?" Rabbi Meisels, I never knew him. He died in Chicago. I was in 1974. I don't know, but I've heard wonderful stories about him. I know his daughter. I know his grandchild. I know his son-in-law, phenomenal people. And Rabbi Meisel's answers, I can't answer you. Do as if you didn't ask me. I can't decide what Jewish law would tell you to do now. And he walks away. And the Jew from Oberlin follows him and says, you have to ask me, Rabbi, you have to answer me. This is a question of life and death. You must answer me. And he said, I can't. I don't have other rabbis here. I don't have Jewish law sources. I don't have a Jewish court to decide. Do as if you didn't ask me. And again, he pursues it till the rabbi finally says, do as if you, whatever you think is right. And the Jew says, I see that according to Jewish law, you are not allowing me to redeem my child, knowing another child will be taken in his stead. I have an only son. Heaven forbid we should ever be faced with that situation. But he said the Jew from Oberlin spent the day going around saying, I'm doing what God told me I need to do. This is what Jewish law dictates, and I will do it. That kind of strength isn't common. It's an incredibly powerful, powerful strength. And Rabbi Meisels has a number of vignettes that he tells over. And one of them was that on Simchat Torah, which is the holiday when we finish the reading of the Bible, the cycle of the reading of the Torah, the Bible, 50 boys were taken to a gas chamber in Birkenau. And they realized they're going to die. We don't have Torah scrolls. We don't have the Bible scrolls. We're going to sing and go out in a positive way. And they started singing songs which translate into English are, how fortunate is our lot in life. And God, please purify our souls before we die. And the Nazi guard over this gas chamber is furious. How are you singing and dancing? We're going to slaughter you right now. And they said, we're going to be leaving this world, which is ruled by dogs and degenerates like you, and joining our families, which you murdered. Said, we're happy to leave this world and not be with you anymore. And the Nazi guard was enraged. And he said, I'm going to make you endure a slow, painful death. And they were taken to a special block, and they were going to be tortured long term. There's an expression that God plans, man plans, and God laughs. The next day, most of these 50 boys were taken out on a transport out of Birkenau, and the rest of the 50 boys blended into the general population. I don't know who survived, but some did. And those kind of powerful stories, and he tells one more of, he comes to Birkenau with his prayer shawl, and he knows he can't keep it, so he forms it into a smaller garment. In Hebrew, we call it tzitzis. Biblically, we wear it with fringes on each of the four corners. And he's wearing it for over a year in the camp. And he's the only one in Birkenau wearing this Jewish garment, which religious men wear. And one day, a Nazi named Willie sees the bulk in his clothing as he's coming out of, they would shower once in a great while. And Willie starts beating him. And he says, you're coming to my office in 5 minutes. Tell me what this is. And he comes to his office and he's being beaten. And he says, this is God's clothing. It's biblical clothing. And Willie accepted the answer and he lets him live. And a few months later, Willie gets angry at Rabbi Meisels again. And he takes the tzitzis, he takes the garment and throws it in a fire. And his son, Zalman, reaches for it, can't be saved. It's burned. And he says, Father, maybe the only reason we survived was because you fulfilled that biblical commandment. And maybe that's why we made it to this point. God has a funny way of paying back. It's the end of the war. Rabbi Meisels and his son, Zalman, are taken out on an open-air cattle car to get away from Birkenau. And Willie demands the Jews bring a couch so he can lay down in leisure, along with some of his Nazi evil cohorts. Rabbi Meisels leans his head on his son Zalman's shoulder, and his son Zalman says, Father, please, my shoulder hurts so much. Please move your head the other way. Rabbi Meisels moves his head the other way, and at that instant, a bomb from an Allied airplane lands in the cattle car where Rabbi Meisel's head was. And it lands on Willie's hands, who were blown, and the hands are blown off. And his cohorts, his Nazi cohorts, are taunting him. Willie, those are the hands that ripped Rabbi Meisel's garment. That's payback. That's divine payback. And they saw it. And Willie died there, but they saw that's the hand of God. And I think sometimes God's hands come through with individuals who are special. Rabbi Meisel survived the war, rebuilt his family. And when I was telling over this story in the Holocaust Museum, a woman from the audience, I quoted the son's name wrong. And she corrected me. I said, "How do you know?" She goes, "Those are my brothers." Wow. Wow. And I've gotten to know her. She's a very friendly woman. I've gotten to speak with her many times over the years. I see her grandson regularly. And I asked them a few months ago, there are 3 schools in Chicago named after your father and grandfather. There are over 2,000 kids in those schools studying Torah and Bible studies every single day. Would your grandfather have believed it if someone came to him in Birkenau in 1944 and said, "Father, you're going to have 3 schools in Chicago that you helped found and are named after you with 2,000 kids?" And I don't think his daughter knew how to answer that. No one had ever asked her that, but his grandson said he had a lot of faith. I said, but that doesn't answer the question. So I think to some extent that God picked certain individuals who would lead the next generation, who had shown incredible faith throughout, and who were willing to endure. And one of the points, when the Jews were taken away from Lokava, the rabbi told them, and this is firsthand from Abba Halperin, who told me, he said to them, we have to accept the suffering to leave this world in a good mental place. And he constantly kept the Jews' spirits updated. They consoled them to raise their morale. And he said, it's time for Messiah to come and not be afraid. And one time when Joseph Reynolds came back to Matstubern, to the labor camp, they made the rabbi stand in the public toilets and clean it with his hands. And Mr. Aronovitz started crying. And the rabbi said, "Don't cry. Never show weakness. Always show strength and be proud of who you are." So when you get those kind of messages, those are the messages that when I heard them, it was a one-way street for me. These are the people I want to find out about. These are the people I want to learn about. And these are the people to emulate. And their value systems are eternal. And they pass that on to their children, who become strong, incredible people.
I think a lot of times too, when the opposition, like those soldiers, when those 50 boys that started singing, when they see something that's God-fearing, like, and they see that even at death they're fine with it, because I'm going to go to a better place. I'm going to go back to my God that created me. I'm going to be with my family. I'm going to be happy, and that really pisses them off, because they don't believe in God. They think that they are terminating you and you're done, and they're doing the most evil thing they can to you, because there is no life after this. You're done. We're decimating your race. You're going to be wiped from the history books, that type of attitude. And when they come at them with the attitude, no, I'm going to a better place. You can kill me if you want to, but I'm going to a better place. You're going to send me to a better place. That's not what they want to hear. They don't want to hear that I'm sending you to a better place. They want to hear misery and fear and anger and all these other feelings that they're looking for. They thrive off of that. They glory off of that. And when they don't get it, it's probably pretty upsetting. And then when you talk about those boys,
the hope that they were given because of what they were taught by their mothers and fathers, to help take a bit of the sting away from the awful conditions that they were in.
Yeah, and that's, so when I brought the picture of the rabbi of Lokava to Mr. Aronovitz, he looked at it with such love. I mean, he just was, he hadn't seen a picture of, this was 1983. He hadn't seen the rabbi since 1941 when he was killed. So in 42 years, he looks at this picture. Do angels glow the way he glowed? I don't know. But when I brought this picture to one of my cousins, an older cousin, and I found I was a cousin 2 days after I went to Israel in summer of '84, Aryeh Golfus, he looked at that picture, and when I came through his door, he looked at my yarmulke and he said, "Oh, I see you're religious. I prepared lunch for you, but I don't keep kosher, so you're not going to eat it." I said, "I appreciate it. I'm not coming to eat." And Aryeh Golfus looked at that picture with such fright, and he recomposed himself after probably 30, 40 seconds. And he's fighting back tears, and he says, "This rabbi was an angel. He pulled me aside every day to teach me." And why would the rabbi of a town of 500 Jews spend time with a teenager unless he saw that something's wrong in this teenager? There's a faith lacking. And that's what we talked about before with every sheep meant a difference. And as relates to Uriah, you said brilliantly that the faith was so important and that they knew they were God-fearing people. So Mr. Aronovitz told me one time it was Passover and Easter, and the Nazis had drunken themselves into a stupor. And the commandant, the commander of the camp, had to be helped on a table. They gathered all the Jews to listen to be berated. And these are Mr. Aronovitz's words. He said, the Nazi got up, he says, "You Christ killers, you filthy pigs, you dirty Jews." And then he said, and this is the broken words are his words. He goes, "I know the Bible, everything. And I know you're the chosen people. And I know that Hitler's going to lose the war." Now, he'd be killed if he said this and he was sober. "And you're going to rebuild yourself as a people, because what I see of your people," and these are his words, "you are undestructible." He always spoke with a broken English, the way my father did. "But you will rebuild yourself post-war. Hitler will lose the war, and the Jews will rebuild themselves into a nation again." There's an expression in all languages that when wine or liquor goes on the tongue, truth comes out. So I think what endured for them was this incredible faith. And Mr. Aronovitz told me years later, whenever he went to synagogue services every day, he saw the rabbi in his eyes. So I think a cure for society today is we need leaders who care for each sheep, who care for every sheep. When Moses went off when he first talked to God, he went up because he was a shepherd and one of the sheep had gone astray. And I think when we have leaders, and I think we all have teachers who we grew up with who made differences in our lives.
And you know, in our communities, we can all be leaders. We can be a leader to our neighbors, to our coworkers. We can all be leaders.
Yeah, but it's few and far between. And I think other people have suffered because they don't have these leaders. And I think we have to look at examples of and Mr. Aronovitz told me, and I'm going to say the Hebrew phrase and I'll translate it, of this Nazi in essence said the words Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. The eternity of the Jewish people isn't a lie. And we've endured and persevered the worst of circumstances. And if anyone would have said post-war that 3 years later the state of Israel would be established, no one would have believed it. So I think, people like Giselle Pearl, the doctor who worked on these pregnant women, and Mr. Aronovitz and Abba Halperin, and this cabinet maker, and these were people, and Manis Kagan, the captain of work, these were people who saw the good in humanity and said, "I'm going to do my utmost." And I want to relate one other person, and his name was Nicholas Winton. And there are hundreds of these kind of individuals, but he made a huge difference. He went to Czechoslovakia on a vacation. He realized pre-war, this is 1938, the situation, and he arranges for 669 children to be saved. And he has to find sponsors with them. He formed this phony organization that made him look official. He forged documents. And there's a movie about him that recently came out called One Life, and there's a 60-minute type video in England that they did of him. I forgot the name of the show. Um,
This is your life?
This Is Your Life, I think. And they were saying like, he didn't brag about what he did. It came out later in life, and they found documentation in his attic of what he had done. God rewards people who do these things. He lived to 106 years old. And he's on this show, This Is Your Life. And the moderator says, and I show this in my Ida Crown teaching, and I said, have you ever met any of the children that you saved? And he said, no. He said, the woman sitting next to you, you saved her life as a child. And another woman was there with her name tag around her neck of when Nicholas Winton arranged and they had their names around their neck. And then the moderator goes, is there anyone in this audience who was saved by Nicholas Winton? And my class, these are seniors, right? Cool kids, great kids. They're look, every person in that audience, and they were blown away by, was a child that Nicholas Winton had saved. So the moderator goes, you go for vacation in Czechoslovakia, you save 669 children, and then you have tens of thousands of grandchildren. I was, yeah, I guess so. So individuals made a huge difference. And whether it's Oskar Schindler, who saved 1,200 Jews and did it initially, and I've met two of his Schindler Jews, as they called them, and one of them said, quote, he loved women's, and he did it for the wrong reasons. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He ends up saving and buying back, when they were actually sent to Birkenau, 1,200 Jews. At the end of the movie Schindler's List, they show over 6,000 descendants from these 1,200. And there was a movie, The Zookeeper's Wife, I forget the woman's name, where she hid Jews underneath in the caverns of her zoo. And one person I want to mention, and this was one of the people I grew up, and when I worked in teaching, the secretary was one of my closest friends at that point, gave me a book called The Diary of Adam Chernyakov. Adam Chernyakov was the head of the Warsaw ghetto Judenrat, the Jewish Council. And he tried doing whatever he could. Anyone who came in with fur or gold, he took it away. And he sold it on the black market to establish soup kitchens for the children and to establish schools for anyone on whatever level they wanted to learn, whatever religious, not religious, secular studies. And he was trying always to save as many people as possible. And the first day of the deportations on July 22nd, 1943, into Treblinka, where the average lifespan of a Jew was 90 minutes, he asked to exempt the children. And when the children were told they would not be exempted from the transports going to family camps, which was just a ridiculous term, and he knew what was coming. He anticipated they would be gassed. And he said in his final diary entry was, I think 6,000 already, I need another 2,000. They refused to exempt the children. He leaves a handwritten note. He commits suicide and leaves a handwritten note. They're asking me to kill the children with my own hands. I won't do it. Today in Warsaw, I've been to his grave 4 times. It's a tremendously large monument, but it's a testament to people who stood up for what was right. And what was the right thing to do as a Jew, and what was the right thing to do for your people. And he was an architect. He was a cleric. He was no big leader, communal leader. But there were other leaders who didn't do what he did. But he stood up. And I think these are the examples that inspired me in my individual life to keep reading about and to keep understanding what made them tick. What made this woman's grandparents, who I see at trade shows, save Jews when other people turned their back and looted their houses? And I think a lot of it is what we get from our parents, what we get from our families, and the value systems our teachers, who are an essential part of raising us, have taught us.
Just try to picture, would the ladies from The View, would any of the anchors on MSNBC, CNN, or any of these others, would any of the majority of the legislatures on the Democrat side, would you find them that if they had lived in 1941, 1942, would they have been hiding Jews? And
Would
I can tell
Ilhan
you
Omar
right
be
now,
hiding
the
Jews?
answer is no. They absolutely wouldn't, because they would have followed the crowd. They would have gone with the popularity, and they would say right now, "Oh yeah, I would have been part of that. Oh yeah, sure." Just like in the Bible, they said, "I wouldn't have killed the prophets," and they would have. It's the mentality that they have, that they would have gone along with whatever's popular, with whatever's the in thing, whatever the government is preaching, which is wrong, whatever it is, they would have just gone along with it, and they would have not participated with that. A lot of the stories you're telling is a lot of those survivors, they had to be pretty strong, because if they were separating one to the right and one to the left, because trying to find out, well, who's going to the furnaces and who's going to slave labor, they're probably looking for people a little bit more healthy, because they wanted the
For
slave
sure.
labor.
For sure.
And even with the boys, the 1,400 boys, where if you're not at least this tall, then you're going to the furnaces. Why? Because if you're not that tall, then you can't go out there and work. And so we're talking about 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. I have a 7-year-old, and you can just see how destructive that is if you're taking young kids, young boys, and just slaughtering them because they're bugs to you. They're meaningless to you. All you're looking for is the free labor. And so these few men that were able to survive Auschwitz and Birkenau, they had to have pulled a lot of strength to be able to keep their labor going every single day, day in and day out, with so little food. Because if they would have weakened, if they had showed sign of weakness, they would have just pulled them out and just either shot them on the spot or sent them towards the furnaces. So there's a tremendous amount of strength there. So do you have some of those stories of some of those people and what it was like to be around the furnaces, what it was like to know that people were dying right next to them and they're still just part of the slave labor group?
There was the Sonderkommando, as you mentioned, which was a unit that was charged with taking care of the bodies and processing the bodies as they were being gassed. There's two movies, one called Son of Saul and one called The Gray Zone, which show the horrors of the furnaces. And these people were liquidated every 3 months because the Nazis didn't want them to tell what they saw. One group in late, and ironically, the Hamas attack was October 7th. On October 7th, 1944, Rosa Rabata was a woman who worked in the Farben plant making explosives. And she was sneaking out a button-size amount of explosives every day. And she was bringing it to the Sonderkommando people. And finally, they decided on October 7th, they blew up Crematoria 4. The work that these people did was beyond horrific. And their experiences, and few of them survived. And Rosa Robato went to her death being tortured, but not revealing any of the people she worked with. That existence, and very few of them survived because they were liquidated every 3 months. And the reason they attacked on October 7, 1944 was they realized their 3 months were up. Almost none of those people survived. But I did talk to one survivor of Treblinka. There were 6 main death camps in Poland. There was Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was the largest, which killed about 1.2 million people. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Treblinka killed about 850,000. There's nothing left of it. And I'll tell a quick story about that in a minute. There was Belzhitz, which started with gas vans, where they would take the exhaust of a gas tank and put it into a van, but couldn't fit many at once. There was Chelmno, which is the only one of them I've not been to. Also, they use gas. And Majdanek, which was liberated by the Russians in late November 1943. And that is the most intact of all the death camps today. Treblinka, they burned, the average lifespan in Treblinka was 90 minutes. You came, you stripped, and you were murdered. And in Treblinka today, there's nothing left. but there is a monument in metal of where the pits, they buried 850,000 Jews there who were murdered. And at the end, they were trying to destroy all the evidence. The Nazis wanted to cover up their crimes. It was going to be an unwritten chapter in their history. And they did a scientific study of how to destroy the bodies best. And they put wood down and oil and people who were heavier because they hadn't gone through slave labor, because fat burns and burns well. And the fatter people were put on the bottom, another layer of oil and wood. The skinnier people, then the children and the Jews are forced to endure burning those bodies. There was an amazing story that the head of the school board, the Jewish school board in Chicago, was on it. The first time I went was 29 years ago to Treblinka and to Auschwitz and Majdanek. And in Treblinka, the pit is about 8 feet across where all the bodies are, 8 to 10 feet. And the head of the school board told the story that one rabbi was told, if you can jump over the pit and survive and get to the other side, you will survive. We'll let you live. And a secular Jew went up to him and says, Rabbi, I'm going to hold your hand. They jump, and God's miracle, they're on the other side of the pit. And the secular Jew turns to the rabbi and says, I understand you have the merits, you're a religious person. How did I make it? And the rabbi said, well, I grabbed onto the coattails of my forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Jew says, and I grabbed onto your coattails. When you hear that, and you're at that pit, Uriah and Ingrid, it is a life-changing experience. And when you hear from survivors how they heard Nazis telling them you're going to live again and rebuild your lives, and you hear survivors say, I never missed one prayer services and I have faith throughout, these show that there are people who are incredibly powerful, strong people who we need to understand and learn from and emulate. 2 blocks from me is a survivor who's about 90 years old, went to school with his children. And when he got off the train, he was told, boy, you're 16. No, I think it was 13, 14. You're 16. Don't argue. You're 16, because 16, like you said, with the boys who didn't make it, you could live. And he's well in his 90s. And he would speak at many of the schools around, and he would bring his uniform was like totally in terrible condition, but he had his number, and he took a number on another prisoner's uniform. And my son heard him speak when he was a young boy, and he said, when he comes into school with that uniform, he's captured the audience already. I mean, imagine coming with a uniform that was worn by someone who survived. And he said his faith made it through. And one incredible story he told me, and he writes it in a book called, I think it's called A Boy Named 68813. I don't remember exactly. It's a boy named with his numbers. And he autographed it for me, and he wrote a very beautiful inscription. And he said post-war, many people had buried their possessions in their homes, in the ground of their homes. He said his sister went back to their home in Hungary, dug up their Sabbath goblet, their wine goblet, and the Sabbath candlesticks his mother lit, and it was in a burlap bag, and she hid it behind her bag because the farmer came out who stole their house and with a pitchfork. What are you doing here? I'm don't worry, I'm going. He uses that goblet every Friday night, and his sister lights the candlesticks every Sabbath Friday night. So certain things come out, and the first trip I was on, a man came, a rabbi from St. Louis came with his 2 sons. And he said to his son, my mother buried gold right here, and there's concrete here. Break the concrete and get the gold. First of all, it had probably been dug up already, but also no one wants to end up in a Polish prison at night. No one wants to end up in a Lithuanian prison at night. But I think the strength and the belief and the religious upbringing that we get at home is, on any level, in any generation, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's 2025, whether it's 2000, that strength of humanity is essential to raise communities and children who have positive value systems and who care and do the right things and step in.
There's a lot of stories about these survivors, and you're going through a few of them. Which were some of the more impressive ones where like the one that was on the conveyor belt that almost didn't survive? Do you have some details of a few people that kind of went through the worst and then thought they might not make it through, but actually did? Do you have the details of what they actually went through besides just the labor,
Yeah.
what they went through and how they came out?
So here's another wild one. Of two rabbis, Rabbi Aaron Orkeach of the city of Belz, Poland, and his brother Mordechai, who was from Bilgari. And they knew that as rabbis and as communal leaders, they were going to be killed. They knew that that was the first. The Nazis were quite wise in that because they knew by cutting off the heads, the rank and file don't have anywhere to turn. So they were being led out by a high-ranking Hungarian officer as captured generals, clean-shaven, dressed normally, and they passed checkpoints and were stopped at the last checkpoint to get out to safety. And they were about to be let go when all of a sudden the border guard said, "No, we don't have any report of these three captured Hungarian generals, two captured prisoners, high-level prisoners." And they thought that they were stuck. And the driver said, "Oh, I thought we were clear. I thought we would be okay." And all of a sudden, three officers on very beautiful horses come, salute the two captured generals, and order the border guards to let them pass. And the Hungarian driver says, "Whoa, I don't know these officers. I know all the officers. I don't recognize them. Who are they?" And the two brothers, the rabbis, say, "That was our father, our grandfather, and our great-grandfather." So I think, to me, like, that kind of story is an incredibly powerful thing. And another story of enduring and survival is Rabbi Chaim Zelikaplinsky of Lokave, who was able to instill in his people what was right. And he showed strength always. And this was directly from Abba Halpern, who told me, when they burst into his home, and I was in that house 6 years ago. I was in that house. The woman who owns the coffee shop, which is now the rabbi's house, was the largest house in town. And I knew that that was where the population gathered on Jewish holidays. And everyone this son brought a casserole, this son brought whiskey, and this son brought cookies, and this son brought cake, and everyone, together celebrated Jewish holidays and observances. And they came into the rabbi's house, and to give a little more detail, the rabbi had 6 children. And this was one of the things really that inspired me to want to find out, because his older son was killed in a terrorist attack in Israel in 1929. His wife died in 1935. The second son, Abraham, was married, and a marriage then in a small town was a communal event. Everyone went, and everyone celebrated. And his third child, Tzvi, was engaged to my father's sister, Devorah Liba. And that really inspired me to find out more about. And I asked people, they were engaged, did they get married? And they thought that they had gotten married, but Devorah Liba, which would have been my aunt, and I have pictures of her, a very beautiful young woman, and she was visiting her brother, Shmuel Elijah, Eliyahu in Hebrew, in the city of Kaunas, and they were taken into the ghetto, apparently, I found out, and they were killed with 110,000 other Jews, and it's a mass grave there. The fourth child, Gittel Valensky, left for Israel before the war, find out what happened to her father, and lost all her faith. 2 daughters remained in the house, Batya and Devorah. They're ripping the rabbi's beard out. and they're making fun of him. And Batya and Devora watch their father saying, "You evil Nazis, you're pulling out the beard of an old man." And rabbis then, a beard is part of the aura and majesticness of the rabbinate, of the rabbis. And they hand the Nazis a scissors and they cut it. But I think the day-to-day strength and the power that he had mentally is so incredibly inspirational that he was never willing to acquiesce. They weren't the master race, the Nazis. And like the 50 boys said, it's a sad state when dogs like you and degenerates like you are making the laws. So I think these kind of stories, in the worst of circumstances, and even on the day they took the rabbi and my grandfather and Mr. Aronovitz to slave labor at Matstubern, the rabbi is telling them, have faith. Messiah is coming. He's on the way. Don't show weakness. So I think, and the day-to-day existence that the Nazis put them through was brutal and horrible. And they were being starved to death. And imagine coming to God forbid, and you're separated and you never see your parents again. And I asked a couple times to my father, "What? Now tell me about your father." He never saw him again. And when I went to the older cemetery in Lokava, Lithuania, I knew there were only 16 monuments left in the cemetery. The Russians had plowed them up and they used them to pave roads. And I saw pictures of some of the monuments and I knew they were impossible to read. So I Googled and I found a YouTube video that showed that if you put baking flour on the graves, there are two types of inscriptions in the graves. There are ones that are pulled out, which are hard to reveal, but if they're carved in and you put flour over it, you end up revealing the name on the grave. And the first grave I come to, here's this American. I'm with the mayor of the town. I'm with the director of the Silel Cultural Region. I'm with this government worker from Vilnius. I'm with my guide. And here's this insane American who's wearing a yarmulke. And there's a woman who lives across the street from the cemetery watching this crazy American pour flour on a gravestone. What is this insane American doing? And I point to the gravestone and I'm lost for my words, because the gravestone name in Hebrew, Moshe Yitzchak, I guess Moses, Isaac, however you want to translate it, is my Hebrew name. And I look up to heaven. Okay, I get the message. I'm supposed to be here. And you could see the empathy of the mayor and the workers. And I found the rabbi's wife who died in 1935. And my grandmother was there. And it's hard to relate to a grandparent who you never knew and who died. This is 2019. She died in 1927. How do you relate to someone that, I mean, how many years have passed? 63, and 82 years had passed. And I'd seen pictures of her, and it was the first kinship I ever felt with her. But her stone was gone. And I walked the length and width of the cemetery. And there's a Yiddish term for a grandparent as bubby, like grandma. And I always called her my grandmother, but this is the first time I ever referred to her as bubby in that endearing Yiddish term. And I said, "Bubby, I know you're here somewhere. I don't know where, but I know you and that baby girl whose name I'll never know, and no one knew it, are here somewhere." So I think what drove me in my own life's pursuit of what happened was trying to find out the values, the life they led, the privilege of being able to walk in the street. And when I was in the synagogue praying 2 days in a row, the second day a woman came in, an older woman. And I didn't know if she was the woman who owned the building, but she motioned to me like, "What are you doing here?" And the second day I found a different way to break in. And I motioned with my hands like in a prayer. I said, "My papa prayed here." And she goes, "Okay." And I texted my guide quickly, "Ask her what she knows." She goes, "Oh, I know that there were Jews here and they're gone now." Oh, come on. You know a lot more than that. And people aren't willing to talk about that. But I think what drove me in the course of my life was finding out about these people and finding out the stories and their history and the lives they led. My grandfather, where he sat in synagogue, and what value system he had, and how after his wife died and left a young baby, how he cared for the children with such love and with such devotion and with such family values. And even though his business went down because he was focused on raising his children, and I have his pictures in my house. And Friday night when I light candles for Sabbath, I look at his picture, and I look at my parents' picture, and I looked at my son and daughter-in-law, their picture, and I looked at my three grandchildren's pictures, and I know that the value system that they had is eternal, and it's going back from generations way back, and it continues to today. And that to me is a day-to-day inspiration of life.
Do you have any more stories that you would like to share of anybody that
Yeah.
survived? Any
So,
specific stories at all?
yeah. So, this is one I wasn't privy to hear directly. There was a Rabbi Israel Spira, who was from a city of Bluzhev in Poland. And he was one of those rare rabbis who survived the war. But during the war, he was in a camp. I don't remember the name of it. It was a small labor camp. And it was a Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, where we light a candle each night for 8 nights to celebrate the Jews' victory over the Syrian Greeks about 2,000 years ago. And he had an ongoing discussion with a labor Bund Jew named Zamenchowski, who was not religious at all. And he'd go back and forth with Rabbi Spira, like, how can you be faithful in such a time? Look what's going around us. And as the holiday of Hanukkah came, it's probably the most joyous of the Jewish holidays. Certainly children know it, and they get presents galore. My grandchildren don't suffer too badly on it. And I love giving them things and treating them to special things. And as he goes to light the menorah, there are 8 nights and a center stalk that's lit from, and he's given in the days beforehand, they gathered oil from the machine shop, and they snuck it out, and they convinced the Nazi guards that they really needed a can of oil to work the machines that were in the machine shop. And they took some of that oil, and they took from their threadbare clothing, and they formed a menorah candelabra to light the first night of Hanukkah. And there are 3 blessings we say the first night. The first night we say 3, other nights 2. The first one is the blessing of lighting the candle. The second one is that God made miracles then and today, which is kind of appropriate for that situation. And the third one is to thank God for keeping us alive and sustaining us and keeping us strong to this day, which is pretty hard to say when you're in the middle of a death camp and your lives have been decimated and your family has been killed. And he said the first blessing about lighting the candle. And then he said the second one about miracles of our forefathers. And he's about to say the blessing of keeping us alive until today, and he hesitates. And he doesn't know if he can really say it with full heart. And he looks around at the people. And I think on a Jewish level, when we see a candle lit, there's a specialness in it, on any level. And he proceeds with a blessing. And Zamenchowski comes running up to him afterward. He said, Spira, not even Rabbi, Spira, how can you say this blessing when your families around you are being murdered? And he said, you're right. I hesitated for that reason. But then I saw the faith and hope in the lives of every prisoner here. And I knew it'll be better. And how do you know? The next day, how do you know it's going to be better? But that faith kept him going. Zamenchowski and Rabbi Spira both survived the war. They're both living in New York. And years later, Rabbi Spira gets a message from Zamachowski. That which you told me that night stayed with me my whole life. And he tells another story of how he's called out in the middle of the night, Spira, we need you to come forward. And he's petrified. That means special treatment, which isn't good. And they say, no, no, don't worry. You'll be okay. And they hand him a letter from a Jew named Aryeh Kornblit. And he said, I'm in a slave labor camp. My wife was killed yesterday, and I'm about to be killed. I want you to write a Torah scroll, the holiest of all Jewish elements, in my memory and my wife's memory. And he opens the letter, and an old $50 American dollar bill comes out. And when Rabbi Spira survived the war, he came to America with a single possession, the $50 bill. He comes to New York in 1946. He tells over the story at a Saturday night gathering. And in the course of a few months, they raised the funds, and then it was probably about $20,000 to write this Torah scroll in their memory. So here you see an example of someone who forges in his mind that the future of our people is what's important. And one other story I'm going to relate, and there are hundreds of these stories. There was a Jew named Simcha Unsdorfer. And he also, similar story of Hanukkah, he's lighting the menorah under his barracks. They catch him and he's about to be killed. And the Nazi is yelling at him and screaming at him that, how do you dare to do this, to observe Jewish holidays? And that moment, there's an air raid siren. And the Nazi runs for his life, and Simcha Unsdorfer runs out in the cold winter in December with his makeshift menorah and his faith intact. While there was a lot of faith, there's one story I actually talked to as head of a Jewish school in New York, Rabbi J.J. Schechter, and his father was the first chaplain in Austria I think it was in Dachau in Germany, post-war to gather, and it was just this time of the year, literally in the Jewish calendar, exactly these days of the year, and they hosted the first post-war prayer gathering, and hundreds of people came. And Rabbi J.J. Schechter's father, Rabbi Herschel Schechter, was leading the congregation, and it's the first time they probably prayed in a couple of years for some of them. And a Jew from the back screams out, how can you pray to the God that destroyed your families and threw them in the ovens? What an incredibly powerful statement. And I've learned, to those who are not religious, to my cousin who was willing to feed me and then realized I kept kosher, that there's no questioning, and I would, God forbid, never question what they went through and how they lost faith or gained faith. And so Rabbi Schechter, as the head of the congregation, went to this Jew and he hugged him. He just hugged him. He didn't have an answer for him. And I asked his son, what did your father say? He said, I don't know. But I think that love for fellow Jews and fellow humanity is what gets us through on a day-to-day basis. And these kind of stories are inspirational of people who survived. And when General Eisenhower went through Ordruf and they forced the population there to go in and see what was happening in the camps where all the Germans said we didn't know anything. And he went to one of the leading rabbis there, and he asked them, what can I get for you? And he wanted religious objects to use for the Jewish holidays. He didn't look for food or extra rations. So I think the faith in these stories is an incredible inspiration. And that's because we had leaders who made a difference, who stood up for what was right.
Yeah, they're emotional stories because, everything we hear about what happened in Auschwitz and all these other places, they're just such destructive and sad stories of just about death and harm. And it's always good to hear the positive side about those who survived, but not only survived, but were able to come out and actually have families, live another 65 years, have generations that have gone past them. That the positive side of it is what we want to relay here, that it's not just about the death and horror, but good came out of it. People were able to survive, and not only survive, but survive still with their faith intact. It wasn't, I hate God now, because a lot of people will think that what kind of God would let this happen, right?
Right.
A godless, a lot of people coming out of war just, they just lose their faith in that, because God wouldn't let this type of thing happen, this type of destruction happen. But to be able to come out and still have that type of deep faith and know that, yes, millions died, but thousands survived, and there was a lot of people who stepped up, hid Jews, and even if they only saved them by the tens and hundreds, a few by the thousands, even though millions were dying, they were still saved.
And
so
that one individual, and the Bible teaches that he who saves a single life, and this is what they inscribed at the end of the war when Schindler was going to be captured as a Nazi, because he was a member of the Nazi party. They inscribed a ring, and Jews took out their gold teeth and they made a ring for him. And inside the ring, and this was told to me firsthand, it's in the movie as well, but I heard it firsthand, they inscribed in the ring, "He who saves a single life is as if he saved an entire world." And that's a really incredible thing.
And every life that was saved, it mattered to that one, even if it was
Yeah.
only in the tens and hundreds and
Yeah,
thousands.
it's and every life. I mean, the people I talked to were, and not everyone was as fierce a countenance as like Abba Halpern, who never missed a prayer service, but certain people had, and I've struggled with this conclusion that I've come to, that, and I think that every person who survived, God said, "I've got a mission for you. This cabinet maker, you're going to be signing over your check to educate your Jewish grandchildren." And I think that doesn't answer why certain people died. Maybe they fulfilled whatever missions they had. And I always struggle with that. Why certain people made it and why they didn't. But they're just incredible people to talk to and listen to. And like I said before, when Abba Halpern gave that blessing to my son before he went in the army, like, wow, how do you not cherish a blessing coming from someone who had such incredible endurance and faith? And Abba Halpern was probably 5'4", 120 pounds. He wasn't a powerhouse. And Joseph Aronowitz was probably 5'4", 5'6", a skinny man his whole life. And people came out of the Holocaust weighing 70, 80 pounds as adults. And yet they built themselves up. He built himself up. And he had a phenomenal nurse whose name was Miriam, who he married.
Huh.
And she was a nurse to Mengele. And they fell in love, and they got married post-war, and he was in the hospital for months and months. And sometimes there are beautiful endings of stories.
And there's also the other side we have to watch and be careful for, because the same type of attitude that created Auschwitz, that created the Holocaust, is alive and well today. And it's alive and well in scary ways in our universities and our schools. So we're trying to just make sure the audience understands that and recognizes it for what it is, and actually steps up and actually does something about it. Because the main problem that most of the Germans and the Lithuanians and the Austrians and a lot of these other people had was not that they went out there and pulled the gun out and started shooting Jews themselves, but it was the attitude of, I'm not doing anything at all, just not lifting a finger, just hear no evil, see no evil, I'm not involved with it, it's not me. And it is that attitude of that, I'm not participating in it, but I'm not preventing it either. If you're not actively doing something to help out, you might as well just stand up there with a gun yourself. It's that
Absolutely.
Complacency where you think you're not guilty, the complacency still makes you guilty, because you need to actually do something about it. Even if what you do is just talk about it, that's enough to start a wave of people that are actually actively doing something. Because the
Absolutely.
problem is if you don't actively talk about it, if you don't actively voice your opinion amongst your family, your kids, your friends, your neighbors, and then they don't know where you stand, and then when the common belief of society comes, and the media comes, and all these other opinions come, and they think that, generally speaking, the majority of people are accepting that opinion, they follow it. Whereas if you voice your opinion, make your opinion known, then when those opinions come, they're not so susceptible in following that, because they find strength. They find someone else that believes something differently. They'll lean on somebody else that has a set of core beliefs. So just by simply saying something, you might prevent a lot in the long run by just opening up your mouth and letting other people know about it. Because if you're not afraid to stand up for it, you might give someone else confidence to stand up for it, which might give someone else confidence to stand up for it, and soon you've got a lot of people standing up against that. But if you're complacent, you just keep your mouth shut, and all of society all of a sudden keeps their mouth shut, and then something like this will happen again, which is what's happening right now. Because if you look at our modern media, they're excusing it, they're rationalizing it every way from Sunday, trying to tell the public that what Hamas is doing to Israel isn't evil. What the protester on campuses, that isn't evil. It's your First Amendment right. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing, and it's wrong. It's evil. And when you rationalize something and you just talk your way out of it, and you don't stand up for solid beliefs, this happens. What happened in Germany in World War II will happen again, and it's happening right now.
This episode and this information needs to be available to every school child in America. Every teacher that's listening, anybody who knows a teacher, a parent that's homeschooling, this information should go out. How can they contact you, Marshall, if they would like to get more information?
I think the easiest way, and we never know who it, but if someone is serious about it, I am more than willing to make the time. I guess they can contact me through the podcast. Would that be okay to do?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
just email us at usa@godandcountrypodcast.com. So, I mean, he is offering his services to any teacher out there that would like to actually bring him on and have him do a course with your students, or do a quick.
We can easily Zoom. I had the privilege over the course of time, and how I actually started. One of the ways I started teaching the Holocaust was a very forceful principal who sent me into a classroom one day when the teacher didn't show up, and I was running a youth group out of this school, and he wasn't somebody you could say no to. And he said, "You're teaching," and then he listened. He says, "You're a natural," and then he said, "Sunday you're going to teach a Holocaust course." And I taught Holocaust and other subjects for over 34 years in the Chicago and suburban area. And last year I taught it at a high school level, which I was petrified to do to high school seniors. It was the most amazing class of wonderful kids. And I would be more than willing to spend time with any teacher. And thank God I have a flexible schedule at work, and I work for myself. And I would be more than happy to address any teacher and any subject. You can contact me through the podcast. And after spending a couple hours, I both feel that we're friends already, and I'm more than willing to go along. I give you both an incredible amount of credit for what you're doing, because this is phenomenal. And Uriah, I could say I'm almost angry at you, because now I feel that I have to go back and Ingrid, to listen to every podcast before this, because I was really impressed with the way you handle it, and I was very pleased to be able to participate with you.
We're grateful to have you. This is incredible.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure that I hope the public understands what we're trying to do here, because we're just trying to wake people up essentially to reality, because this is real. What happened in the Holocaust was real. It happened. And it was just one little seedling that just got put out there, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And Hitler started off with the Lithuanians and just tested out and see what they'd be willing and unwilling to accept. And then he just molded society. But it started small and it grew. And what we have to recognize is you can't let the seedling start. You can't let the small movement start. So when people are siding with a terrorist organization, when people are protesting that Israel and saying stuff like river to the sea, and then justifying it and being complacent with it, that's the seedling. That's how it starts. And it's going to grow and grow because they're going to see, well, society accepted that, next step. And then society will accept that, next step. And they'll just grow their movement until it becomes what happened then.
Well, that's when good people have to step up.
We talked about this a while ago, but you look at a representative like Ilhan Omar, and she's a foreign agent. She's not a U.S. representative. She doesn't care about the United States of America. She abhors the United States of America. She's only in that position to meet an end, to reach a goal, which is the same goal as Sharia law and jihad. She'd be out there burning the American flag if she thought she could get away with it and not be mass
She was
protested.
asked last week about the murder of the two Israeli diplomats in Washington, and she refused to answer. She already got to go. She refused to say anything.
Typical.
So, yeah, yeah.
It's simple, small stuff where people don't recognize the small steps and they just let it grow, or you just ignore it. You watch it on the news and say, "Yeah, well, that's not good. That's sad." And then you just go about your day and you do nothing about it. That's complacency. That's what allows things like this to happen. You've got to be a little more vocal. Again, if you're just vocal with your kids, with your neighbors, with your family, it would give them confidence to be vocal about their opinions, and maybe you could persuade them and they could persuade others. And then that's how these movements stop, because those who are trying to push the movements find out that there's a lot of pushback, and then they'll stop their little small steps and say, this isn't working. We got to try something else. Doesn't mean they're going to stop trying, but it stops them enough to make sure we don't lose entire generations where
Right.
the students that we're seeing up on these universities are completely convinced that Israel is at fault, that the Jewish people are at fault, or that white America is the problem. It's these narratives that kill society, that kills the community. And you got to stop them in their tracks, because if you don't stop them in their tracks, they will grow, they will get worse. They'll get to the next level, and the next level, and the next level, until you have genocide, until you have someone coming out and killing two Israeli representatives like we just saw a little while ago.
I just want to relate two quotes which stick out in my mind. One is, there was a pastor, Martin Niemöller, during the war, who said, when they came for the trade unionists, I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. They came for the communists, I wasn't a communist, and I didn't speak up. When they came for this, I didn't speak up. When they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And when they came for me, because he was against Nazi policy, it was too late because there was no one left to speak up anymore. Another quote, it's in the basement of the Holocaust Museum, by Elie Wiesel, is, when you are indifferent, you end up siding with the perpetrator and never the victim. Indifference is wrong. I wonder, can I relate one more story which I remembered?
Oh yeah, we love stories.
This must have been, my mother passed away in 1999, so I think it was 1998. She had a leg injury and was in a rehab institute not far from home, and this shows the importance of hearing survivors' voices while there's still some alive. And her roommate was a woman named Henny Hirsch, nice German woman. And I was old enough to understand that not all Germans were bad, that she was a Jewish woman. And I never really got to know her much, but her husband came in to visit. And I said, and with a heavy German accent, the guy was about 5 feet tall and 90 pounds. And I said, when did you leave Germany? Now, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was November 9th and 10th, 1938, when they destroyed hundreds and hundreds of synagogues and looted, every Jewish shop they could find. And he said, I left November 11th, 1938. I'm like, that's the day after Kristallnacht. How did you leave Germany the day after? He said, I had the papers and I got out. I'm like, whoa, tell me about it. What do you remember? And he said, I wasn't very religious, but I stood in front of my synagogue, and the Nazis, sadly and wisely, had taken the police population from one city and exchanged it with other cities. So no one could say, you grew up here, don't burn down the synagogue, you grew up on the street. So there was no affinity to their hometowns. They weren't their hometowns, they were foreign towns to them. And Mr. Hirsch stood in front of the synagogue, and he said, and had a beautiful balcony, and he makes a hand motion like for the balcony. And because in Orthodox synagogues, the men and women are separated so that the emphasis is on prayer and not person who's, of the opposite gender. And he said, and I told the Nazis, if you burn down my synagogue, I'll kill you on the spot. Here's a man who's 5 feet tall and 90 pounds with a fierce countenance. And he says, if you burn down my synagogue, I'll kill you on the spot. And they left. And for that night, he saved the synagogue. I'm like, wow, what an incredible strength you had. And I said, I got to process it. Can I ask you more questions? When's the next time you're here? He said, and Germans are known to be exact on time, exact. And he says, I'm here every night at 7:00. And all day long, I'm trying to work and I'm only focused on questions. And I took a Leo pad and I wrote down scores of, must have been 25, 30 questions. And I'm waiting for him. And I get there early and I'm waiting. And his wife looks at her watch and it's 7:01, 7:02. She goes, something's wrong. My husband's never late. And she calls security. They found him in the parking lot coming to see her. He got out of his car and he dropped dead of a heart attack. And I realized I was this close to an immediate survivor of a major Holocaust event. And while I was fortunate enough to hear how he saved the synagogue for that day, it was probably burned down later, I missed out the opportunity. And that really fueled me to find out as many interviews as possible and find out about the city, find out the city where my roots are, find out about stories of individuals. And I know there's a woman in the community who I know well who reads 2 biographies of Holocaust survivors a week. I can't overdose like that, but there are stories of individuals. And I think, Uriah, as you talk about changing the narrative today of these college campuses, I think if we tell the truth long enough that in the end, the truth will win out. And that's the hope that we have to have for the future, for our children, for our grandchildren, and for our society in general, that the best of us comes out and not the worst of us.
Well, like you mentioned, when the Americans first started liberating Germany and Eisenhower came in, they saw that first concentration camp, and they went to offer them food, and they were conservative because if they gave them too much food, it'd also be too dangerous for them. But then they went down and grabbed the populace from the city and forced them to come up and do hard labor in burying the bodies. The reason why I point that story out is the people, even though that they didn't physically go up there and witness the atrocities up there or how bad or how evil it was, they didn't physically go up there. They knew it was there. They knew what was happening. They heard the stories. Right. The guards up there would not close their mouths, so that they had a general idea of what was going on in these concentration camps, and they did nothing. They said nothing, they did nothing. And we as a society, I see us a lot of times are doing the same thing. It's just sitting back and just letting things happen and not going over there investigating how bad it is, the evil purposes behind it, how bad the atrocities were, what actually happened on October 7th, and getting into the details of that, or any other crime that could be committed. You're standoffish, not my problem. I'm just walking away.
In
that's
Majdanek,
what foments evil. That's
right.
what gives it fuel. You've got to be able to be a little more brave, have more value, have more sense of ethics, to be able to be openly, without fear, stand up for something like that and do something about that. Open your mouth.
In Majdanek, which was a death camp outside of Lublin, we mentioned earlier, which was liberated by the Russians in late November 1943, they had a fall harvest there, as they called it, where they gunned down 18,400 Jews on November 3rd, 1943. And the indigenous population around the camp stood on their roofs. They were playing marching music, and they were clapping as the Jewish population in Majdanek was liquidated. So I think we have to get to a position in life where people are churning their efforts to do wonderful things and positive things. And we just have to keep trying and keep hoping and praying.
I agree with that. Ingrid, any last words?
Again, I'm so grateful to hear these stories and be inspired by the hope and it makes me want to be a better person. Makes me want to make sure that I hold strong to my faith and be a little bit braver to speak out. And I really encourage anybody watching this podcast, if you know of a teacher or anyone, even to share this episode. We need to get the truth out before history fades away.
We very appreciate what you do for humanity and for the Jewish people, and your support means a lot to us.
Thank you.
Well, please.
You both did an amazing job, and I'm deeply appreciative to you.
We're grateful for that too. So we want to get this podcast out. We want it to grow. So it is important for you as a listener to subscribe, one, and then share it. We can't grow without you subscribing. We can't grow it without you sharing it to others. There's no other way that the podcast gets out other than word of mouth. So you got to help us get this podcast out there. Listen to the other podcasts that we put out. Be on here next week when we'll have a couple other Utah legislators on board with us. Again, with our podcast, we're trying to mix a little bit of religion and politics with it, a little bit of something that's God-fearing as well as good positive morals and values. We're not trying to preach to anybody, but we're trying to make sure that people understand that if you have a base, if you have a value, that should seep into everything that you do in life. We appreciate everybody being on board with us. We hope you stay on board with us throughout the future podcasts, and we will talk to everybody next week.